Hey everyone. Tonight we're stepping back a full century into a decade wrapped in neon light, the hum of jazz, and the quiet echo of typewriters in city offices. The 1920s, often remembered as the Roaring Twenties, are usually painted in gold and champagne, but the truth of how Americans really spent their free time was far more ordinary, subtle, and human. Before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always enjoy seeing the mix of places and time zones gathered here for these long, sleepy journeys. Now, dim the lights, maybe pour a warm drink, and let the quiet background of the evening settle in. We begin at the edge of a great transition, a nation just out of a world war, holding its breath, uncertain yet restless. A country where leisure was slowly reshaped into something entirely new. The First World War had left deep marks upon the American landscape, though the nation had entered it later than many of its European counterparts, and had suffered fewer direct devastations. By the time the armistice was signed in November of 1918, the United States stood in a peculiar position, powerful, economically ascendant, and yet uneasy in the silence that followed. Soldiers returned home to parades and bunting, but they also returned to factories where jobs had shifted, to farms where markets had changed, and to families who were adjusting to a world altered in both subtle and dramatic ways. The 1920s did not arrive all at once with its jazz and lights. Instead, it crept in slowly, shaped by this uneasy transition from war to peace, from regimentation to rest, from sacrifice to leisure. The years immediately after the war were unsettled. Demobilization brought millions of men back into the workforce, creating strains that could not be absorbed overnight. Inflation rose as wartime price controls were lifted, and workers who had accepted restraint during the war effort now pressed for better wages and conditions. Strikes erupted across industries in 1919, in steel, coal, and even among the police in Boston. This atmosphere of discontent did not immediately suggest a society at play. Yet beneath these conflicts there was a quieter yearning, a desire among ordinary people to reclaim time for themselves, to enjoy hours that had been devoted to labor or sacrifice, to fill the evenings with something other than worry. Leisure, though not yet fully visible, was beginning to gather in the shadows. The shadow of the war lingered in other ways too. The influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919 had killed hundreds of thousands in the United States, leaving communities hollowed and cautious. Public gatherings, which had once been frequent, had been curtailed in many cities under orders to prevent contagion. As restrictions lifted and the memory of illness began to fade, people were eager to reassemble in theaters, parks, churches, and clubs. The very act of being together became a form of leisure, a reclaiming of something denied. If later the 1920s would be remembered as loud, colorful, and restless, it was because they were born from a period of enforced stillness and restraint. The political climate added its own layer of unease. The Red Scare of 1919 and 1920 spread fear of radicalism, with raids and deportations that targeted immigrants and labor organizers. This atmosphere created suspicion, but it also pushed many Americans to turn inward, away from politics and toward private pursuits. Leisure began to take on the shape of escape, from headlines, from unrest, from the noise of demonstrations. Families turned to more personal forms of recreation, evenings around a phonograph, Sunday drives as automobiles became more common, or neighborhood games of baseball. It was not yet the organized consumer leisure of the later decade, but the seeds were visible. Economically, the early 1920s were unstable, with a brief depression between 1920 and 1921. Factories that had produced munitions and uniforms found themselves without markets. Farmers who had thrived on wartime demand now faced collapsing prices, and unemployment rose. But even in this moment of contraction, there was a peculiar sense of potential. The technology that had been accelerated by war, radio, aviation, automobiles, and motion pictures was still present, still waiting to be adapted to peacetime uses. The transition was rough, but the foundation was being laid for leisure industries that would soon dominate the decade. For returning soldiers, the adjustment was personal as well as economic. Many had seen Europe, even briefly, and brought back impressions of different rhythms of life. Some longed for quiet stability, preferring evenings on porches or at community dances. Others, especially the younger men who had served abroad, found small-town life dull and looked toward the city with its bright lights, music halls and amusements. The clash between rural and urban sensibilities, between old forms of recreation and new ones, would define much of the 1920s. But here, at the dawn of the decade, it was still an unsettled question. The federal government's decision to enact prohibition in 1920 added another layer of transformation. Alcohol, long tied to social life, was suddenly outlawed. Taverns closed, breweries shuttered, and what had once been ordinary leisure, the evening drink with friends, now required secrecy and risk. This pushed leisure underground, creating the conditions for speakeasies and jazz clubs. But in the very first years it simply deepened the sense of uncertainty. Americans were adjusting to a new legal order that seemed to demand restraint even as people hungered for release. The press of modern life was also becoming more visible. Electric lights extended the day, streetcars carried workers farther from home, and factories operated on strict schedules. Leisure then became not only a desire but a necessity, a counterbalance to the regularity of industrial time. Newspapers and magazines began to fill with advertisements for entertainments, sports and consumer goods that promised pleasure in hours outside work. The language of rest was shifting. It was no longer simply about recovery from labor, but about identity, status and participation in modern culture. Immigration had slowed during the war and in its aftermath, but cities remained diverse, filled with neighborhoods of Italians, Irish, Germans, Jews and African Americans migrating from the South. Each group brought its own patterns of leisure, church festivals, musical traditions, games and social clubs, and together they formed the patchwork of urban recreation. Though the nation often spoke of itself as unified, the ways people spent free time remained highly local, tied to community, class and ethnicity. This too was a legacy of the war years, the need to create cohesion at the national level, contrasted with the persistence of highly specific neighborhood-based leisure. By the early 1920s then, the United States was a nation in flux. It had emerged from war stronger in global standing, but restless within. Its people sought relief from years of sacrifice, illness, and labor disputes. Leisure was beginning to shift from a luxury to an expectation, from a private indulgence to a public industry. The decade would see this impulse blossom into dance halls, movie palaces, amusement parks and radios in nearly every living room. But here at the beginning, leisure was still tentative, fragile, uncertain, yet deeply desired. It was the quiet after the storm, the moment of breath before the plunge into modernity. This emergence from war, with its mingling of relief and unease, created the atmosphere in which the leisure of the 1920s would take shape. It is impossible to understand the Roaring Decade without remembering that it began not in noise but in silence, not in celebration but in cautious adjustment. The jazz, the cinema, the automobiles, and the speakeasies were yet to come, but their roots lay in this moment of transition, when a nation, weary from war and illness, first looked around and asked how it wished to spend its free time. The 1920s were, above all else, a decade of cities. For the first time in American history, the 1920 census revealed that more people lived in urban areas than in rural ones. It was a milestone that went largely unnoticed at first, but its implications would shape the rhythm of daily life, and with it, the way leisure was understood. Cities had been growing steadily for decades, but in the aftermath of war and the acceleration of industry, they took on a new character. The hum of the city was not only the sound of work, it was also the sound of leisure, layered into the noise of streetcars clattering along tracks, neon signs flickering to life as daylight faded, and crowds moving purposefully between workplaces, theaters, and amusement halls. Streetcars defined the geography of the urban day. They carried clerks and typists from outer neighborhoods to offices downtown, but they also carried them back in the evenings toward amusements that clustered near the same central hubs. Fares were cheap, and the ability to travel quickly across the city expanded the options for how free time might be spent. No longer confined to the small radius of a neighborhood, Urban dwellers could meet friends on the other side of town, visit parks that had once been too distant, or seek out the newest movie palace glowing on a main avenue. The streetcar, mechanical and predictable, set the tempo for leisure, regular, accessible and communal. The skyline itself had begun to change. Skyscrapers were climbing higher, their windows reflecting the light of dusk, their lobbies filled with marble, brass and the sense of a new modernity. At their bases, shops and cafes offered places to linger after work. Neon signs, still a novelty in the early 1920s, announced everything from soda fountains to dance halls, glowing in red and green against the night sky. For the urban worker, the city itself became a spectacle. To walk its streets after dark was to be entertained by light, sound and movement. Even those who could not afford regular amusements found leisure in strolling, window shopping, or watching others pass. The rhythms of city leisure were closely tied to work schedules. Offices closed in the late afternoon, factories released shifts, and suddenly the streets filled with bodies moving outward. Newsboys shouted the evening headlines, bootblacks packed up their kits, and streetcar conductors braced for crowded rides. From there, paths diverged. Some went home to quiet suppers, but many lingered, stopping at corner soda fountains, meeting acquaintances in cafes, or drifting toward larger entertainments. For the first time in American history, leisure became something shared by mass numbers simultaneously. It was no longer confined to private rituals, but existed as a public rhythm, visible in the movements of crowds across avenues and through the glow of marquees. For immigrants and first-generation Americans, the city offered a mingling of traditions. Italian neighborhoods might host open-air gatherings with food and music on summer evenings, while Jewish neighborhoods often centered around cafes or cultural societies. African Americans migrating from the rural South to northern cities brought new musical styles that would soon echo from dance halls and speakeasies. In this way, urban leisure was not a single phenomenon, but a layering of many small traditions, each finding its place in the grid of streets and tenements. Yet, despite these differences, all were shaped by the same tempo: the mechanical clock, the streetcar's route, the glow of electrified nights. Theaters dominated the leisure landscape of cities. Some were small Nickelodeons, holdovers from earlier decades, but many were vast movie palaces seating thousands. These buildings, decorated in ornate styles with chandeliers, murals, and plush velvet, offered more than a film. They offered a sense of occasion. Attending a show became not merely entertainment, but a ritual of modern life. Crowds lined up outside under marquees, lit with hundreds of bulbs, the hum of the crowd mixing with the faint notes of an orchestra inside. Even before the film began, the very experience of being there was a leisure activity. Restaurants, too, became more varied. While fine dining was still the preserve of the wealthy, the rise of chain lunchrooms and soda fountains brought affordable meals to clerks, shop girls, and laborers. These were not only places to eat, but to socialize, to linger over a plate of pie or a glass of soda, to exchange news, and to watch the world move past the window. For many city residents, these small moments, an hour in a cafe, a stroll along the streetcar line, an evening window shopping, formed the texture of leisure more consistently than grand entertainments. The city was also noisy, and that noise itself shaped leisure. The honk of automobile horns, the ring of streetcar bells, the chatter of newsboys, and the constant thrum of construction created an environment that was never still. In such a place, leisure was not silence but distraction, something to pull attention away from the relentless sound of machinery and commerce. Jazz spilling from open doors, the organ in a movie palace, or simply the hum of voices in a crowded park, offered a kind of relief, not by quieting the city, but by joining its rhythm in more pleasurable ways. Parks and public spaces were essential outlets, designed in earlier decades by planners like Frederick Law Olmsted. They provided green relief amid stone and steel. On Sundays and holidays, families filled these spaces, spreading blankets, playing games, or simply walking the shaded paths. Here the rhythm slowed, though it was still shaped by the pulse of the city. Vendors sold refreshments, bands played on pavilions, and crowds gathered for free performances. Leisure in the park was communal. shared among strangers, and it mirrored the broader shift of the 1920s, away from private, insular recreation, and toward collective, visible pastimes. At the heart of all this was time itself. The war had accustomed Americans to schedules, to efficiency, to measuring life in hours and minutes. Factories had done the same, binding workers to shifts and bells. Now, in the city of the 1920s, that measured time spilled into leisure. Theaters began shows at precise hours, streetcars ran on set schedules, and radio programs, soon to dominate the decade, would announce their start times down to the minute. Leisure became something one could plan, anticipate, and fit neatly into the structure of the day. It was no longer only about filling idle hours. It was about managing them, selecting among many possible amusements, and joining the rhythm of a crowd, all moving according to the same clock. This was the urban rhythm of the 1920s, mechanical yet alive, structured yet filled with possibility. It was a rhythm that drew people outward, into public spaces, into theaters, onto streetcars, and under the neon glow of marquees. It was not always glamorous, not always loud, but it was consistent, shaping the habits of millions, who found themselves part of the first truly urban nation. And within this rhythm, leisure became not just an indulgence, but a necessity, a way of keeping pace with modern life, without being overwhelmed by it. As the decade unfolded, this rhythm would intensify, layered with jazz, automobiles, and the spread of new technologies. In its earliest years, it was simply the sound of a city humming, the quiet spectacle of light and movement, the shared awareness that free time was no longer confined to the home, but was scattered across the avenues of a growing metropolis. If the cities of the 1920s pulsed with neon and the restless shuffle of streetcars, the countryside moved to a slower, older rhythm, one shaped less by clocks and timetables than by seasons, weather, and the patterns of farm labor. For the millions of Americans who still lived in small towns or on farms, leisure was not a neon-lit spectacle, but a quiet and often communal activity, woven into the daily responsibilities of tending land, animals, and households. To understand leisure in the Roaring Twenties fully, one must place the glittering image of urban nightlife, alongside the quieter, more measured habits of rural life, where entertainment was still local, seasonal, and largely free from the hum of machines. Farming remained the backbone of rural existence, and this meant that leisure could never be entirely separated from work. The timing of free hours depended on planting and harvest, on milking and feeding schedules, on the endless maintenance of barns, fences, and tools. In spring and summer, days stretched long and left little energy for recreation, but in winter, with fields lying fallow and daylight short, evenings allowed for longer gatherings around stoves and fireplaces. Unlike the predictable 5-day work week emerging in the cities, rural leisure remained irregular, dictated by natural cycles rather than industrial ones. To those accustomed to the city's constant flow of options, country leisure could seem sparse, but to those living it, the slower pace offered its own satisfactions. The central gathering place for many small towns was the church, not only as a site of worship, but as a hub for social activity. Sunday services were followed by conversations on porches, shared meals or visits with neighbors. Church socials, picnics and festivals provided some of the few organized opportunities for entertainment in rural communities. These events were modest compared to the dance halls of Chicago or the theaters of New York, but they carried a sense of continuity, connecting generations and reinforcing the bonds of community. Leisure in the countryside often meant reinforcing existing relationships, strengthening ties that would be essential in times of hardship or harvest. County fairs were perhaps the most anticipated events of the rural year. They combined the practical with the entertaining displays of livestock, competitions in baking or quilting, demonstrations of new farming equipment, and midway amusements with rides and games. For young people, fairs were one of the few chances to meet others outside their immediate town or township, a chance to walk among bright lights and music that echoed, however faintly, the atmosphere of the city carnival. But fairs were temporary, often lasting only a few days, and once dismantled, life returned quickly to its slower, more repetitive rhythm. At home, leisure was often domestic and modest. Families gathered around oil lamps, or increasingly in the 1920s, electric lights where rural electrification had begun to spread. Reading was a common pastime, with newspapers, magazines and the occasional novel circulating through households. The Sears Roebuck catalogue itself was not only a tool for ordering goods, but a kind of entertainment in its own right, allowing families to imagine objects and fashions far removed from their daily lives. Storytelling, music played on fiddles or harmonicas, and board or card games filled evenings when work was done. Leisure here was less about novelty, and more about repetition. The same stories retold, the same songs played again, the same familiar games passed down through generations. The arrival of new technologies did, however, begin to reshape rural leisure in subtle ways. The radio, once expensive, grew increasingly affordable, and reached into even remote communities. By the middle of the decade, families gathered in kitchens and parlors to listen to broadcasts of news, sermons, music and sports. This intrusion of national culture into rural spaces did not erase local traditions but added another layer to them, allowing farmers in Kansas or Iowa to share in the excitement of a heavyweight boxing match taking place hundreds of miles away. Leisure, once confined to the immediate community, began to stretch outward, binding rural families into a broader national rhythm. Automobiles also changed patterns of recreation. The Model T, relatively affordable, allowed farm families to travel farther for entertainment. A trip into town on a Saturday night became a ritual in many communities, as people filled main streets, shopped in general stores, attended local theaters if they existed, or simply gathered to socialize. For many, the automobile represented a kind of freedom, not only from the isolation of rural life, but from the strict pace of farm work. A Sunday drive through the countryside, with no destination other than the pleasure of movement, was itself a form of leisure unknown in earlier generations. Yet, for all these changes, rural leisure remained modest, compared to the exuberance of urban nightlife. There were no vast movie palaces in farming towns, no towering neon signs to draw crowds, no endless array of amusements to choose from on a given evening. Entertainment was often homegrown, dependent on the initiative of neighbors and communities, rather than large industries. Dances might be held in barns, accompanied by fiddles and accordions. Ice cream socials in the summer drew families together under elm trees. Baseball games between local teams provided both competition and festivity, often followed by picnics. These events were simple, inexpensive, and highly participatory. Leisure was not something consumed so much as something created. The contrast between rural and urban leisure reflected deeper cultural divides. Rural communities often viewed the amusements of cities with suspicion, seeing jazz clubs, speakeasies, and late-night entertainments as signs of moral decline. Many of the strongest supporters of prohibition came from these areas, where alcohol was associated less with sophistication than with disorder. Leisure was supposed to be wholesome, strengthening families and communities, not loosening restraints. While city dwellers danced in clubs until dawn, rural Americans were more likely to be in bed early, conserving energy for the demands of the next day's work. It would be misleading, however, to suggest that rural leisure was joyless or purely conservative. For many who lived it, the quiet of evenings on porches, the rhythm of community gatherings, and the predictability of seasonal festivals were deeply satisfying. Leisure was not about novelty, but about continuity, not about escape, but about affirmation. In the stillness of a summer evening, with crickets chirping in fields and the stars unspoiled by electric light, leisure was found in conversation, in silence, and in the simple awareness of rest after labor. The 1920s thus contained two distinct leisure landscapes. The cities buzzed with activity, lights, and the constant possibility of new amusements, while the countryside moved more slowly, rooted in traditions that stretched back decades if not centuries. Each had its rhythms, its satisfactions, and its limitations. The decade would be remembered as roaring, but in much of rural America, it remained more of a steady hum, a continuation of old patterns with only gradual intrusion of modern innovations. To understand the decade in full, one must keep both pictures in view, the sparkling city avenues and the quiet rural porches, two sides of the same national story. each shaping how Americans spent their free time in profoundly different ways. The year 1920 marked not only the beginning of a new decade, but also the start of an ambitious national experiment, one that would reshape the contours of leisure across America, in both intended and unintended ways. With the ratification of the 18th Amendment and the enforcement of the Volstead Act, the manufacture, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages became illegal throughout the United States. To its advocates, prohibition represented a moral victory, a safeguard for families, and a means of curbing social ills long associated with drinking. To its opponents, it was an intrusion into personal freedom and a disruption of long-standing customs. Whatever its justification, the new law altered how Americans sought recreation, particularly in cities, where the ban gave birth to an entirely new culture of hidden leisure, the speakeasy. Before Prohibition, alcohol had been a central part of social life. Taverns, saloons, and beer halls were gathering places not only for drinking, but for conversation, politics, and community. They stood on street corners in working-class neighborhoods and lined the avenues of cities. With Prohibition, these spaces vanished almost overnight, their doors shuttered and their signs removed. But the habits they embodied did not disappear. Instead, they went underground, reappearing in disguised venues tucked behind storefronts, basements, and apartments. Thus, the speakeasy became one of the most defining leisure institutions of the 1920s, a paradoxical creation, born directly from the attempt to eliminate alcohol. The term speakeasy itself came from the quiet discretion required to enter. Guests whispered passwords at concealed doors, gave knowing glances to doormen, and stepped into dimly lit rooms where alcohol flowed, despite its illegality. These establishments varied widely in size and style. Some were nothing more than backroom gatherings with cheap liquor served in chipped glasses, while others were elaborately decorated clubs featuring orchestras, polished bars, and dance floors. They were united, not by their appearance but by their shared function as refuges from the dry law, places where drinking could continue under a veil of secrecy. Music quickly became central to the speakeasy experience. Jazz, already spreading from its roots in New Orleans and African American communities, found a natural home in these clandestine spaces. Its improvisational rhythms and lively energy matched the sense of rebellion that clung to speakeasies. The saxophone, trumpet, and piano filled smoky rooms, mingling with the clink of glasses and the low murmur of conversation. To sit in a speakeasy was to feel part of something modern and slightly transgressive, to share in the rhythms of a new music that seemed inseparable from the hidden culture of drinking. The paradox of Prohibition was that while it sought to eliminate alcohol, it instead broadened its allure. Drinking became less an ordinary habit, and more a symbol of defiance, a shared act of resistance against a law many found impractical or unjust. In cities especially, speakeasies multiplied at a rapid pace. Estimates suggest that by the mid-1920s, New York City alone had tens of thousands of such establishments, far more than the number of legal saloons before Prohibition. The very attempt to suppress alcohol created a vast underground industry that thrived in secrecy, yet was no secret at all. For many patrons, the thrill lay not only in the drink itself, but in the ritual of entering a forbidden space. A discreet knock, a murmured password, and suddenly one was inside a world that felt separate from the ordinary routines of work and family. The speakeasy offered a kind of escape, not only from sobriety but from the conformity of the outside world. It was a stage where modern styles of dress, dance, and behavior could be tried out with less scrutiny. Women, increasingly visible in public leisure during the 1920s, played a prominent role here as flappers, their shorter skirts, bobbed hair, and cigarettes signaling both modernity and independence. Behind the glamour, however, lay a network of crime and corruption. The illegal liquor trade provided enormous profits to bootleggers, smugglers, and organized crime syndicates. Figures such as Al Capone in Chicago became infamous, not only for violence but for their control of alcohol distribution. Speakeasies depended on this underground supply chain, which stretched from Canadian distilleries to local stills producing bathtub gin of dubious quality. Police raids were frequent, but bribery and political connections often ensured that many establishments continued unimpeded. Leisure in the Prohibition era was thus deeply entangled with illegality, a fact that gave it both an edge of danger and a sense of inevitability. The design of speakeasies reflected their dual nature, as both illicit and enticing. Many were hidden behind unmarked doors, reached through stairwells or alleys, or disguised as ordinary shops, a florist, a cafe, or a soda fountain. Once inside, however, the atmosphere shifted. Some were lavishly decorated with oriental rugs, mirrored walls, and velvet drapes, creating an aura of luxury that contrasted with the secrecy outside. Others were stark and functional, their main appeal the mere availability of drink. The variability itself became part of the experience. Each speakeasy had its own character, its own clientele, and its own whispered reputation. What made the speakeasy particularly significant was its role as a social equalizer. In a time when social classes were often rigidly separated, these hidden venues brought together a mixture of people, businessmen and laborers, artists and criminals, immigrants and native-born citizens. While divisions still existed, the shared act of drinking illegally blurred some boundaries, if only temporarily. Jazz musicians, many of them African American, performed for diverse audiences, helping spread musical innovations across racial lines, even as broader society remained segregated. Leisure in the speakeasy was thus both inclusive and exclusive, open to many who could find it, yet hidden from the official gaze of the law. The speakeasy also marked a shift in the very idea of nightlife. Before Prohibition, drinking had often been confined to male-dominated saloons. With the rise of speakeasies, mixed company became more common, and late-night gatherings became central to urban leisure. The night itself took on a new importance, its hours filled with music, dancing, and drinking in hidden spaces. Leisure no longer ended at dusk, but extended deep into the early morning, a pattern that would define modern urban culture long after Prohibition ended. As the decade progressed, Prohibition remained in place, but public respect for it dwindled. The sheer ubiquity of speakeasies made enforcement nearly impossible, and the normalization of illegal drinking eroded the moral authority of the law. By the late 1920s, the contradiction had become clear. A nation officially committed to temperance was in practice saturated with alcohol. In this contradiction lay one of the central ironies of the decade, that an attempt to suppress leisure instead expanded and transformed it, creating spaces more vibrant, diverse, and influential than those that had existed before. In the quiet analysis of history, the speakeasy appears less as a minor curiosity, and more as a defining feature of 1920s leisure. It embodied the paradox of the decade, a society yearning for modern pleasures, willing to bend or ignore laws to obtain them, and increasingly comfortable with the blending of legality and illegality in the pursuit of enjoyment. For millions, the experience of leisure in the 1920s was inseparable from the hidden doors, whispered passwords, and smoky rooms of the speakeasy. It was a culture born of Prohibition, yet it thrived precisely because Prohibition existed, a reminder that leisure often takes its most powerful forms when it is denied, restricted, or hidden. The 1920s are often remembered not only as a decade of technological change and social experimentation, but also as an era when sound itself took on new shapes, rhythms, and meanings. In the quiet evenings of cities, in the smoky corners of speakeasies, in the crowded dance halls where feet struck polished floors in time with pulsing beats, there was a new music that defined leisure in ways no other had before. It was jazz, born from African American traditions of improvisation, blues, and ragtime, and it rose in this decade to become the soundtrack of modern America. The jazz awakening was not sudden, it was gradual, spreading note by note, radio by radio, club by club, until its rhythms came to represent the spirit of an age. At its root, jazz was both a continuation and a transformation. Its roots reached back to New Orleans at the turn of the century, where brass bands, funeral processions, Creole melodies, and African rhythms fused into something fluid and improvisational. All musicians like Buddy Bolden and Jelly Roll Morton experimented with syncopation, allowing melodies to wander away from strict rhythm, creating a sense of spontaneity that felt alive. This spirit traveled north during the Great Migration, when African Americans moved from the South into cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York, carrying with them both the memory of old songs and the ambition to create new ones. By the 1920s, jazz had taken firm root in the nightlife of northern cities. Clubs became the crucibles where jazz flourished. In Chicago, the South Side was alive with establishments where small bands played for hours, weaving improvisations that seemed never to repeat in the same way twice. The Sunset Cafe, the Lincoln Gardens, and other venues drew crowds not only from African American neighborhoods, but also from curious white audiences, eager to hear this new sound. Musicians like King Oliver, with his Creole jazz band, and a young Louis Armstrong, who brought brilliance to the cornet and trumpet, were central figures in shaping these spaces. Their performances turned leisure into an event, where listening became an act of discovery and participation. The Harlem neighborhood of New York became another central stage. The Harlem Renaissance was not only a literary and artistic movement, but also a musical one. Clubs such as the Cotton Club, although segregated in terms of audience, showcased the talents of Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, and Fletcher Henderson, whose orchestras filled evenings with a sophistication that matched the elegance of the setting. Jazz here was polished but still deeply rooted in improvisation, blending African American musical traditions with a cosmopolitan sensibility that appealed to broader audiences. Though Harlem was geographically just one neighborhood, its cultural influence radiated far beyond its borders. Radio accelerated this spread. Before the 1920s, music was something one had to attend live, whether in a theater, church, or parlor, but the rise of radio networks meant that the sounds of jazz could reach households hundreds of miles away. Families gathered in living rooms around wooden radio cabinets, listening to live broadcasts from ballrooms and hotels where jazz orchestras performed. For many Americans, this was their first exposure to jazz, a sound unlike the formal compositions of European classical music or the folk songs of rural life. It was syncopated, unpredictable, sometimes dissonant, and above all modern. To hear it through the crackling airwaves was to feel connected to a wider world of change. The improvisational nature of jazz made it ideally suited to leisure in the 1920s, a decade defined by experimentation and the loosening of old restraints. Jazz musicians rarely followed sheet music strictly. They played around it, inventing phrases in the moment, responding to one another with riffs and flourishes. For listeners, this created a sense of spontaneity. Each performance was unique, each night slightly different. Leisure became not simply repetition, but an encounter with the unexpected. The very act of listening to jazz was in harmony with the broader spirit of the decade, a willingness to explore, to break rules, and to embrace the fleeting present. Dancing was inseparable from the rise of jazz. The rhythms demanded movement, and dance halls filled with people eager to learn the Charleston, the black bottom, and the Lindy Hop. Leisure here was physical, embodied in steps that were faster and looser than the more restrained dances of previous generations. Couples spun, kicked, and swayed to the syncopated beat, often until late into the night. In this way, jazz was not only a music to be listened to, but also a music to be lived, shaping how bodies moved and how nights unfolded. Jazz also carried symbolic weight. For African Americans, it was a form of cultural expression and pride, evidence of creative power in a society that still imposed segregation and discrimination. For white audiences, it was often exoticized, treated as daring, or even scandalous, especially by critics who feared its sensual rhythms. Yet its spread across racial lines revealed the complex ways in which leisure could transcend, even if only temporarily, the barriers of the time. Jazz became both a unifier and a divider, embraced by many yet criticized by those who saw it as a threat to traditional values. The influence of jazz extended beyond clubs and radios into broader culture, fashion, literature, and even slang began to reflect the rhythms and sensibilities of the music. The very phrase jazz age, popularized by writer Scott Fitzgerald, captured not only the sound but the mood of the decade, restless, modern, exuberant, and tinged with both beauty and fragility. Leisure in the 1920s cannot be understood without recognizing how deeply jazz permeated everyday life, turning evenings into performances and weekends into celebrations. For those who experienced it, the jazz awakening was not always about famous names or grand clubs. It was also about small moments, a piano in a neighborhood cafe, a phonograph record spun at a house party, a local band playing in a rented hall. Jazz was everywhere, filtering into leisure in ways both large and small. It was as much about ordinary listeners as about the stars, about the way music seeped into the rhythm of evenings and reshaped the patterns of free time. Looking back, it is clear that the spread of jazz in the 1920s was more than a musical trend. It was a cultural shift that redefined how Americans thought about leisure itself. It blurred the lines between high and low culture, between public and private spaces, between formal performance and spontaneous creation. In its improvisation, it reflected the improvisational nature of the decade's leisure as a whole, where rules were bent, traditions questioned, and new pleasures discovered. Jazz was not just background music, it was the very atmosphere in which free time was lived. The 1920s were not only a decade of sound, but also one of motion. Music alone might have stirred the imagination, but it was the pairing of jazz rhythms with new exuberant styles of dance that made leisure in the decade feel like something unprecedented. Across the country, from the glittering cities of the East Coast to the smaller towns of the Midwest, evenings were filled not merely with listening but with movement, with bodies learning new steps that seemed to break from every standard that had governed polite society's dancing in the years before the First World War. Dance became both pastime and spectacle, a shared language of physical expression that was accessible to the young, the curious, and anyone who wished to join in the spirit of modern leisure. The Charleston emerged as the signature dance of the era, first appearing in African American communities and stage productions in the early 1920s. It became a national craze after being featured in the Broadway show Runnin' Wild in 1923. Its energetic kicks, swiveling feet, and syncopated rhythm captured the essence of jazz in physical form. Unlike the waltz or the foxtrot, the Charleston was fast, playful, and unconcerned with the strict grace of ballroom tradition. For young people, it symbolized liberation from the formality of their parents' generation, a way to embody the spirit of the jazz age with every kick of the heel and swing of the arms. Dance floors across the country soon echoed with its infectious rhythm, and leisure was redefined as a shared communal act of energy. Alongside the Charleston came the Black Bottom, another dance with roots in African American communities that rose to national prominence in the mid-1920s. With steps that involved slapping the soles of shoes, hopping and swinging the hips, it carried an earthiness that contrasted with the elegance of older styles. The Lindy Hop, though more fully developed in the 1930s, had its beginnings in the Harlem ballrooms of this period, where dancers experimented with acrobatic movements set to jazz. Each of these dances was fast-paced, improvisational, and less constrained by the rules of posture and distance that had once governed the social dance floor. They reflected, in movement, the same impulse toward experimentation and freedom that jazz had already established in sound. Dance halls were the spaces where this transformation took place most visibly. In cities, large venues like the Savoy Ballroom in Harlem or the Aragon Ballroom in Chicago became landmarks of nightlife. They could hold thousands of people, their polished wooden floors stretching wide under bright lights, with bandstands at one end and balconies for spectators. Here, leisure became a public event, not confined to private parlors or exclusive clubs but open to anyone who could pay a modest admission fee. The very scale of these halls reflected the new demand for mass entertainment, and their popularity showed how deeply Americans were willing to embrace dance as a central form of free-time activity. Inside these ballrooms, the atmosphere was charged but not hurried. Musicians played from evening until the early hours of morning, with alternating orchestras, ensuring that the music did not stop. Couples and groups filled the floor, moving in rhythm, adjusting to the changing tempos of the band. Dance contests, sometimes staged for publicity, drew crowds of spectators who marveled at the stamina of couples who could keep moving for hours. Marathon dances, which became popular by the late 1920s, stretched this fascination with endurance even further, turning leisure into a test of persistence as much as skill. These contests blurred the line between recreation and spectacle, as audiences gathered not only to participate but also to watch, cheer, and place wagers on who would last the longest. The spread of the dance craze was aided by film and radio. Silent films often featured musical and dance performances that introduced new steps to wider audiences. Newsreels showed clips of young people attempting the Charleston, making it seem less like a local fad and more like a national phenomenon. Radio broadcasts of dance bands allowed listeners at home to practice steps in their own living rooms, bringing the energy of the dance hall into domestic space. Dance manuals, magazines, and even phonograph records advertised instructions, teaching Americans not only how to listen, but also how to move. In this way, leisure was no longer passive consumption, but active participation, turning evenings into occasions for learning and physical exertion. The social dimension of dancing was significant. For young women in particular, the new dances provided opportunities for public visibility and independence. The flapper image, short skirts, bobbed hair, cigarettes, and carefree movement, was inseparable from the dance floor where women's physical freedom was on full display. For young men, the dances offered a way to demonstrate vitality and modernity. The pairing of partners was still central, but the style of dancing encouraged individuality as much as coordination. Leisure here was not simply about following rules, but about experimenting within them, expressing personality in the fluidity of movement. The popularity of dancing also revealed the contrasts within American society. While urban centers embraced the new styles with enthusiasm, more conservative voices in rural areas and religious circles often condemned them as immoral or excessive. Ministers preached against the indecency of the Charleston, claiming that its movements promoted looseness and irresponsibility. Newspapers carried debates about whether the dance craze signaled the decline of American values. Yet the criticism often only enhanced the appeal for young people, who flocked to dance halls precisely because the activity felt modern, rebellious, and communal. In this way, dancing reflected the broader cultural tensions of the 1920s, between tradition and change, restraint and freedom, rural caution and urban exuberance. For the dancers themselves, however, the attraction lay not in controversy, but in the simple joy of movement. After long days in factories, offices, or classrooms, the chance to spend evenings surrounded by music and peers was a release from daily routines. The dance hall was a space where worries could be suspended, where time seemed to flow with the rhythm of the band, and where leisure became not only an escape, but a form of belonging. The shared beat linked strangers in the same rhythm, erasing differences for the length of a song. In those hours, leisure was not about consumption of goods, but about the collective experience of energy and motion. By the end of the decade, the dance craze had left its mark on American life. The Charleston might fade in popularity, replaced by newer styles, but the pattern it established remained leisure as communal performance, as physical release, and as a defining element of modern social life. The dance halls continued, the steps evolved, and the music kept changing, but the spirit of the 1920s dance craze lingered as one of the clearest expressions of how Americans chose to spend their free time in an era of both prosperity and transformation. The 1920s were an era when leisure found not only its sound in jazz and its movement in dance, but also its images in the flickering light of the cinema. Silent film, though lacking spoken dialogue, spoke volumes through gesture, expression, and movement across the glowing screen. For millions of Americans, evenings and weekends became tied to the ritual of movie-going, an experience that was far more than just a diversion. It was a collective habit, an immersive routine that defined the rhythm of free time for a society newly drawn to mass entertainment. The cinema of the 1920s was not modest. Small storefront Nickelodeons of the early 1900s had given way to grand movie palaces. Vast theaters designed not only to display films but also to overwhelm the senses with architectural splendor. In cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, these palaces were built in styles that borrowed from Gothic cathedrals, Renaissance palazzi, and even Moorish palaces, their ornate interiors filled with gilded plasterwork, velvet drapes, chandeliers, and sweeping staircases. The Roxy Theatre in New York, which opened in 1927, could seat nearly 6,000 people. The Chicago Theatre, opened in 1921, became a symbol of the new scale of entertainment. To enter these places was to step outside of daily life into a dreamlike environment, where leisure was wrapped in the aura of spectacle, even before the first frame of film appeared on screen. Inside, the experience was carefully orchestrated. Ushers in uniforms guided patrons to their seats. Live orchestras provided accompaniment, playing scores that enhanced the drama and emotion of the films. Between features, audiences were treated to stage acts, organ solos, or newsreels that connected them with events around the world. For the price of a ticket, usually affordable, even for working-class families, Americans could spend hours immersed in a layered program of entertainment. The cinema was not simply a pastime, it was an event, a ritual that repeated week after week, creating continuity in the way leisure was structured. The stars of the silent screen were central to the fascination. Charlie Chaplin, with his bowler hat, cane and tramp persona, became one of the most recognizable figures in the world. His films blended comedy with social commentary, drawing audiences into stories that were at once humorous and poignant. Chaplin was not alone. Harold Lloyd, with his bespectacled, optimistic character, brought energy and daring stunts, famously clinging to the hands of a clock high above the city streets in safety last. Buster Keaton, the great stone face, offered deadpan humor mixed with acrobatic precision, performing elaborate stunts that seemed both dangerous and ingenious. Stars like these became icons, their images reproduced in magazines, posters, and fan memorabilia, making cinema-going not only about watching, but also about following personalities who embodied the glamour and excitement of the modern age. The influence of cinema extended beyond the screen itself. Fashion trends were shaped by what audiences saw on film. Women copied the hairstyles of stars like Clara Bow, the original It Girl, whose flapper style became synonymous with youthful modernity. Men took cues from the tailored suits of actors like Rudolph Valentino, whose romantic roles created waves of adoration. The screen offered models of behavior, style, and even romance, influencing how Americans thought about leisure outside the theater. Watching a film was thus not only entertainment, but also participation in a broader cultural conversation, a way of aligning oneself with the rhythms of the age. Cinema also democratized leisure in a way few other activities could. Dance halls and speakeasies were largely urban, but movie theaters spread into towns of every size. Even rural communities, far from the glow of neon signs and jazz clubs, built theaters or converted existing halls to show films. Traveling projectionists brought films to small towns, ensuring that the experience of cinema was not confined to city dwellers. This universality made cinema a shared cultural experience. By the mid-1920s, it was estimated that more than 50 million Americans attended movies each week, nearly half the population at the time. Leisure had never been so collective, so simultaneously experienced across the nation. The ritual of movie-going created rhythms of its own. Saturday nights often meant a trip to the local theater, followed by discussion of the films in homes, workplaces, and schools. Children imitated their favorite characters in play. Adults debated the merits of films or stars. The shared act of sitting in the darkened theater, watching stories unfold larger than life, was itself a form of community. Unlike the private leisure of reading, or the individual pleasure of listening to music at home, cinema was communal, binding strangers together in the silence of collective attention and shared laughter or tears. The 1920s were also a period of technical and artistic innovation in film. Directors experimented with camera angles, editing techniques, and narrative forms. German expressionist films influenced American directors, who incorporated dramatic lighting and shadows into their work. Hollywood became not only an industry, but also an aesthetic center, where leisure was shaped by the artistry of filmmakers as much as by the preferences of audiences. The decade closed with one of the most important shifts in film history, the introduction of synchronized sound. The release of The Jazz Singer in 1927 marked the beginning of the end for silent film, ushering in a new era of talkies. Yet even in its final years, the silent screen had already established the cinema as one of the dominant pastimes of the modern world. Looking back, the place of the silent screen in American leisure was profound. It was not simply a form of escape, though it certainly offered that in abundance. It was also a means of shaping identity, of connecting communities, and of creating rituals that defined the week. To attend the movies in the 1920s was to participate in a cultural phenomenon that linked millions of Americans in shared rhythms of entertainment. Leisure in this decade was no longer confined to small-scale activities, but was scaled up to the size of palaces, stars, and nationwide audiences. The glow of the silent screen, flickering in darkened rooms across the country, became one of the most memorable symbols of how Americans chose to spend their free time in the Roaring Twenties. If the dance hall and the cinema provided places where Americans could lose themselves in rhythm and image, then the sports field offered something more elemental, the spectacle of competition. In the 1920s, leisure became inseparable from the growing obsession with athletic contests, and the decade's fascination with sport was so pronounced that historians later came to call it the golden age of sports. Crowds gathered in stadiums, leaned over radios, and crowded around newspaper stands, eager to follow the exploits of baseball legends, boxing champions, and college football stars. It was a different kind of leisure, one in which the energy of athletes on the field was mirrored by the conversations, debates, and shared anticipation of millions who made these events a central part of their weekly rhythms. Baseball stood at the center of this sporting world, already well established as America's pastime. The 1920s elevated it into a national obsession. Stadiums like Yankee Stadium, opened in 1923, became temples of leisure, vast arenas that could hold tens of thousands of spectators. The crack of the bat, the shouts of vendors, and the swell of the crowd turned each game into an immersive experience that extended far beyond the action on the diamond. For those who could not attend in person, radio broadcasts carried the drama into homes, making baseball one of the first sports to unify leisure on a national scale. Babe Ruth embodied this fascination. His home runs became symbols of power and modernity, feats that transformed the way Americans thought about the game. No longer just a sport of strategy and patience, baseball in the Ruth era became a spectacle of strength and excitement. Crowds flocked to see him play, and newspapers carried detailed accounts of his every at-bat. His celebrity status extended beyond the ballpark, making him a household name even among those who never attended a game. In leisure time, Ruth's image appeared in advertisements, his statistics were debated in barbershops, and his performances were replayed in conversations across the country. Baseball was not only a game, but also a thread that stitched itself into the fabric of everyday life. Boxing, too, claimed a large portion of the nation's attention. Heavyweight bouts drew immense crowds, both in person and via new communication technologies. Jack Dempsey, known as the Manasseh Mauler, became the decade's most celebrated fighter. His matches attracted audiences that dwarfed previous sporting events, such as his 1921 fight against Georgia's Carpentier, which was one of the first to generate $1 million gate. These contests were not merely athletic events, but public spectacles that drew together diverse groups of Americans, all united in their desire to witness strength, endurance, and the thrill of competition. Radio played an important role in boxing's popularity. The 1921 Dempsey-Carpentier fight was broadcast live, allowing listeners to follow every punch in real time. This transformed the nature of sports as leisure, making it possible for millions who could not travel to the arena to participate in the event from their homes. Families gathered around radio sets, neighbors invited one another over, and communities were linked by the shared act of listening. It was leisure experienced collectively, not through physical presence in the stadium, but through the invisible connections of sound waves. College football grew rapidly during the decade, filling stadiums with tens of thousands of spectators and becoming a cultural phenomenon in its own right. The construction of massive arenas, such as the Rose Bowl in Pasadena and Michigan Stadium in Ann Arbor, reflected the sport's rise in prominence. Universities saw football as both a source of prestige and a unifying force for students and alumni, while towns rallied around their local teams with fervent devotion. Heroes like Red Grange, the galloping ghost from the University of Illinois, captured the public imagination with dazzling runs and dramatic performances. His transition to professional football in 1925 also helped elevate the professional game, though it would take decades before it rivaled the popularity of the college version. The rituals surrounding sports extended beyond the events themselves. Newspapers devoted entire sections to coverage, filling columns with play-by-play accounts, analysis and commentary. Photographs of athletes appeared alongside statistics, making stars visible in ways that went beyond the field. Sports writers such as Grantland Rice shaped the narrative, casting athletes as near-mythic figures and transforming games into epics of human endurance and skill. In barbershops, offices and schoolyards, these narratives were repeated, dissected and embellished, turning leisure into a continuous conversation that lasted long after the final whistle or bell. For those who could not attend stadiums or afford tickets, the presence of sports was still palpable. Neighborhoods organized informal games, children imitated the swings of Babe Ruth or the running style of Red Grange, and local gyms became places where young men tested their own abilities in boxing rings or on makeshift football fields. Leisure was not only about consuming the spectacle of sport, but also about reenacting it in smaller, more personal forms. The professional game inspired countless amateur imitations, ensuring that the rhythms of competition extended into daily life. The fascination with sports in the 1920s also revealed something about American society's broader values. At a time of rapid urbanization and technological change, sports offered a form of leisure that felt both modern and deeply rooted in tradition. Baseball connected the present with a game already half a century old. Boxing embodied primal displays of strength in a modern setting. Football linked universities with their communities and created pageantry that fused education, entertainment, and civic pride. Leisure here was not escapism but a reaffirmation of collective identity, a way of binding people together around shared heroes and events. By the decade's end, sports had established themselves as one of the most visible ways Americans spent their free time. The names of athletes were household words, stadiums had become landmarks, and radios ensured that no one was excluded from participation. In a nation that prided itself on energy, progress and modernity, sports offered a stage where those qualities could be dramatized week after week. The fever for competition, spectacle, and shared excitement was woven into the rhythms of leisure, making the 1920s not only an age of jazz and cinema, but also a golden age of athletic devotion. If the flicker of the cinema screen and the roar of the sports crowd were among the brightest symbols of 1920s leisure, the quiet glow of the radio dial represented something more intimate, more domestic, and yet equally transformative. The radio, a relatively new arrival in American homes, became one of the central fixtures of evening life in the decade. Families that had once relied on newspapers or phonographs for entertainment now found themselves drawn together around this new device, its polished wooden cabinet resting in living rooms, parlors, or even kitchens, its speakers carrying voices and music that seemed almost magical in their immediacy. For many, the radio was not simply a machine but a new hearth, a source of warmth and connection that reshaped the rhythms of leisure. The spread of radio was rapid and astonishing. In 1920, only a handful of households owned sets, and broadcasts were experimental, carried out by amateur operators or small stations with limited reach. But by the middle of the decade, commercial broadcasting had transformed the landscape. KDKA in Pittsburgh, often credited as the first commercial station, had begun transmitting in November 1920, covering election results and setting a precedent for radio as a medium of mass information. Within a few years, hundreds of stations filled the airwaves, transmitting across cities, towns, and rural landscapes. By 1924, there were around 600 licensed stations in the United States, and by the decade's end, radio ownership had spread to nearly 12 million households. Leisure, once defined by local experiences, was now increasingly linked to a national soundscape. Evenings around the radio quickly became ritualized. Families would gather in living rooms, chairs arranged to face the wooden box as though it were a fireplace. The hiss of static that preceded a program was part of the experience, a kind of prelude to the voices and sounds that followed. Programs varied widely: news bulletins, comedy sketches, dramatic readings, musical performances, sermons and sports commentary all flowed through the air. For many households, this was the first time leisure brought the outside world into the home with such immediacy. Where once one had to leave the house for entertainment, to attend a dance, a movie, or a game, the radio allowed leisure to take root at the very center of domestic life. Music was among the most popular offerings. Jazz, already spreading through nightclubs and dance halls, now reached families who might never set foot in a speakeasy. Orchestral concerts, operatic arias, and popular songs filled living rooms, democratizing access to performances that had once been confined to concert halls or expensive phonograph records. Dance steps learned from neighbors or newspapers could now be practiced to live broadcasts. Leisure became participatory in a new way, as the rhythms of modern sound spilled into ordinary evenings. Comedy and variety shows also found eager audiences. Programs like The Goldbergs, a family-centered comedy that began in the late 1920s, provided humor rooted in everyday life, while variety programs offered light sketches and songs designed to appeal to the widest possible audience. Unlike the polished, distant glamour of the cinema, radio comedy felt personal, almost conversational, as though the performers were speaking directly into the room. This intimacy made radio uniquely suited to weaving itself into daily leisure, turning otherwise quiet evenings into occasions of laughter and shared amusement. News broadcasts gave radio an authority that extended beyond entertainment. Families could now hear election results, market updates, and international events almost as they happened. The 1920 election coverage by KDKA had already demonstrated the power of radio to carry information instantly, and throughout the decade, this capacity grew. In moments of crisis or celebration, households across the country could tune in simultaneously, experiencing events together. Leisure here blended with knowledge, creating evenings where listening was both entertainment and engagement with the wider world. Perhaps most striking was how radio unified households, where reading had often been a solitary activity, and music on the phonograph could be listened to alone. Radio demanded collective attention. Children sat cross-legged on rugs, parents settled into armchairs, and even neighbors might join if they did not yet own a set. The device became a magnet for gathering, creating a rhythm in which evenings were no longer scattered with individual activities, but concentrated around a shared experience. In this way, radio strengthened domestic bonds while also connecting each household to a larger, invisible community of listeners across the nation. The presence of radio also reshaped conversations beyond the home. Programs were discussed at school, at work, and in markets. A popular broadcast could quickly become a shared reference point, ensuring that leisure was not only experienced in the moment, but also extended into daily life through talk and reflection. In rural areas, where opportunities for collective leisure were fewer, radio provided a vital link to the broader culture of the 1920s, allowing farmers and small-town families to feel part of the same modern age as city dwellers. By the end of the decade, the radio was no longer a novelty but a fixture, its wooden frame polished and its dials familiar. The silence of evenings was filled with voices and music, shaping free time in ways that blended entertainment, information, and community. Leisure in the 1920s was not only about going out, but also about staying in, about gathering in familiar rooms to listen together to sounds that stretched across states and regions. The hum of electricity, the hiss of static, and the warm tones of announcers created a new kind of intimacy, one that was at once domestic and national. The radio evening was in many ways emblematic of the decade as a whole. It was modern yet familiar, collective yet personal, glamorous yet ordinary. It showed how technology could redefine leisure, not by replacing older forms but by adding new dimensions to them. Just as the cinema palace offered grandeur and the sports arena offered spectacle, the radio offered closeness, a shared hearth of sound that carried families gently into the night. The hum of the automobile engine was more than just a mechanical sound in the 1920s. It was the pulse of a society discovering new ways to use its free time. Before the decade began, leisure had been shaped by the boundaries of distance, by the limitations of walking, horse-drawn carriages, and streetcars. The arrival of Henry Ford's Model T, affordable and increasingly ubiquitous, shifted those boundaries almost overnight. By the 1920s, the automobile was no longer a luxury reserved for the wealthy, but a practical possession for middle-class families, a machine that did not merely transport but redefined what leisure itself could mean. Ford's assembly line, perfected in the 1910s, had brought the cost of a Model T down to a level that was within reach of average workers. In 1908, when the car was first introduced, it was priced around $850, but by the mid-1920s, the price had fallen below $300. At that cost, the Model T became an attainable goal for farmers, factory workers, and small-town shopkeepers. The number of cars on American roads expanded at a staggering rate. In 1913, there were about 1.3 million registered automobiles. By 1929, there were more than 23 million. Leisure, once dictated by local geography, now unfolded across wider landscapes, shaped by the possibilities of movement. The Sunday drive emerged as one of the most iconic rituals of the decade. Families would pile into their Model Ts, leaving behind the noise and density of the city or the confinement of small-town streets, and set off into the countryside. Roads were often rough, unpaved and dusty, but that was part of the novelty. The act of movement itself, the sense of wind pressing against faces, the shifting scenery of fields, forests or distant towns, became a form of leisure. Unlike the commute to work, the Sunday drive had no destination beyond the experience of the road. It was leisure expressed as motion, an embodiment of freedom in a nation that increasingly valued mobility. Picnics became closely tied to this new tradition. With a car, families could travel beyond their immediate neighborhoods to find quiet meadows, lakesides or shaded groves. A basket packed with sandwiches, fruit, and perhaps a thermos of coffee or lemonade could transform an afternoon into a small excursion. Leisure, once centered on front porches or local parks, now expanded outward into rural landscapes that were within reach but previously inaccessible. The combination of movement and outdoor relaxation defined weekends in ways that fused modern technology with timeless pleasures. The automobile also gave rise to roadside culture. Gasoline stations, diners, and tourist cabins began to dot highways, small businesses springing up to serve the needs of travelers. What began as practical necessities, fuel, food, rest, soon became part of the leisure experience itself. Stopping for ice cream on a warm evening, or enjoying a meal at a roadside cafe, turned the journey into a sequence of small rituals. The road became not only a means of reaching destinations but a destination in itself, a ribbon of possibility where leisure unfolded mile by mile. For young people, the automobile offered a new form of independence. Courtship and socializing, once constrained to parlors under the watchful eyes of parents, shifted to the privacy of the car. Couples could drive to dances, movies, or quiet country roads, carving out leisure spaces of their own. In this way, the Model T was not merely a family vehicle, but also a symbol of generational change, altering the rhythms of dating, friendship, and youthful recreation. Even rural communities, where distances had long defined isolation, were reshaped by the automobile. Farmers used cars to reach towns more easily, attending fairs, church events, or community gatherings with greater frequency. Leisure in rural America, once limited to what could be found nearby, expanded outward, bringing people into contact with larger social worlds. The car blurred the boundaries between rural and urban leisure, making it easier for small-town families to attend city theaters, baseball games, or shopping excursions. The automobile also reshaped vacation habits. National parks, which had been designated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, now became accessible to middle-class families, who could drive there on their own schedules. Yellowstone, Yosemite, and the Grand Canyon became destinations for car-based tourism, with roads and campgrounds designed to accommodate automobiles. Leisure took on a distinctly modern character. Nature was not simply something to be lived within, but something to be visited, experienced, and then left behind, all with the aid of the car. Yet the experience of automobile leisure was not without its limits. Roads were often inadequate, maintenance was inconsistent, and breakdowns were common. Flat tires, Overheated engines or muddy ruts could turn a Sunday drive into a test of patience, but even these inconveniences became part of the culture of leisure, stories retold with laughter or frustration in equal measure. The unpredictability of early motoring gave the ritual a sense of adventure, even when the destination was only a few miles away. By the close of the 1920s, the automobile had become deeply embedded in the texture of free time. The car was not just a machine of necessity, but a vessel for possibility, for family outings, youthful adventures, roadside discoveries, and scenic wanderings. Leisure was no longer confined to static places, but stretched across landscapes, traced in dust and tire tracks, shaped by the hum of engines and the open horizon. The Sunday drive was both ordinary and remarkable, a simple act that symbolized a broader cultural shift toward mobility, independence, and the embrace of modern technology as a companion to rest and pleasure. In this way, the automobile was more than just transportation, it was a quiet revolution in leisure, turning weekends into journeys, afternoons into excursions, and free time into an exploration of space itself. The Model T did not merely carry Americans from place to place, it carried them into a new way of imagining what it meant to spend one's hours of rest. If the automobile represented freedom of movement and the radio embodied the intimacy of sound, then the amusement park was the stage upon which the collective spirit of 1920s leisure performed its most vibrant display. For millions of Americans, the glowing bulbs of carnival lights and the scent of salty air mingled with fried food marked a world that was neither work nor home, but something suspended between. In these spaces of mechanical wonder and seaside relaxation, the 1920s imagination came alive in ways that were at once thrilling, comforting, and deeply ordinary. Coney Island in New York remained the unrivaled symbol of this kind of leisure. Its reputation as the playground of the masses had been established decades earlier, but in the 1920s it reached new heights of popularity. With its sprawling boardwalks, roller coasters, and sideshows, Coney Island offered a sensory escape from the everyday. For the cost of a modest admission fee, or a few ride tickets, families, couples, and groups of friends could wander into a space where reality seemed rearranged into a kaleidoscope of noise, motion, and light. On summer weekends, crowds swelled into the hundreds of thousands, creating a sea of humanity united by the pursuit of amusement. The rides themselves captured the spirit of the age. Wooden roller coasters, towering and rattling, carried passengers on plunging descents that simulated the speed and risk of modern life in a safe and playful form. The Cyclone, which opened at Coney Island in 1927, would become one of the most famous examples, a twisting structure of wood and steel that embodied both engineering prowess and the desire for thrills. Forest wheels, spinning swings, and fun houses offered lighter diversions, while midway games challenged visitors to test their luck and skill. These attractions transformed leisure into spectacle, a performance of daring and laughter against the backdrop of mechanical ingenuity. Boardwalks added another layer to this culture, stretching along coasts in places like Atlantic City, New Jersey, or Ocean City, Maryland. They became spaces where leisure unfolded as both movement and display. Strolling along the wooden planks, visitors could enjoy the ocean breeze, watch performers, and browse stalls selling everything from saltwater taffy to seashell trinkets. The boardwalk was both marketplace and promenade, a stage where ordinary people could both watch and be watched, their leisure performed in public view. Seaside resorts connected to this culture of amusement provided lodging, dining, and entertainment for those who could afford longer stays. Hotels catered to visitors from nearby cities, offering access to beaches by day and dance halls or theaters by night. The combination of sand, sea, and spectacle created an all-encompassing environment where leisure was not confined to a few hours but could extend across days, blending relaxation with the continuous hum of activity. The atmosphere of amusement parks and boardwalks was not confined to the coasts. Cities and towns across America built their own smaller parks, often attached to streetcar lines or near lake shores. Known as trolley parks, these venues offered roller coasters, swimming pools, picnic grounds, and bandstands, creating destinations for families who might not be able to travel to the larger resorts. These spaces reflected the democratization of leisure. What had once been a luxury became an accessible part of ordinary life, shaped by the rhythms of local communities and regional traditions. For working-class families, amusement parks provided one of the few spaces where money stretched further. A few rides, some snacks, and an afternoon by the beach could provide memories that carried into the work week. Unlike exclusive clubs or high-cost entertainments, these venues welcomed large and diverse crowds, creating a rare environment in which social boundaries blurred if only temporarily. In the laughter of roller coasters and the mingling of crowds on boardwalks, leisure became a collective act, dissolving some of the lines of class and background. The culture of amusement was also illuminated by electricity itself. The bright lights of parks and boardwalks symbolized modernity, drawing visitors into a world that seemed to pulse with energy. At night, strings of bulbs and neon signs reflected against the water, turning the ocean front into a theater of light. In an age fascinated by technology, this play of illumination carried its own attraction, transforming ordinary leisure into an encounter with the marvels of the modern world. Yet beneath the noise and spectacle lay something simpler. The act of walking barefoot on sand, eating a cone of ice cream, or leaning against the railing to watch the waves offered pleasures that required little more than time and presence. Leisure at boardwalks and amusement parks was not only about thrill rides and carnival games. It was about the texture of shared experience, the mingling of the extraordinary and the ordinary. A father holding his child's hand on a carousel, a couple strolling past vendors, a group of teenagers laughing after a dip in the ocean. These were the scenes that defined the quieter heart of amusement. By the close of the 1920s, amusement parks and boardwalks had become fixtures of American leisure, shaping memories and rituals that extended across generations. They reflected the decade's embrace of modernity, while preserving the timeless appeal of gathering, playing, and wandering by the sea. In these spaces, leisure was not bound by clocks or obligations but flowed freely, shaped by the rhythms of rides, waves, and crowds. In the end, the world of amusement parks and boardwalks revealed a truth about the Roaring Twenties, that leisure was not simply about escape, but about belonging, about creating spaces where the ordinary could become extraordinary through the collective act of enjoyment. The glow of lights against the night sky, the hum of rides, and the murmur of the ocean all blended into a soundscape and landscape that defined how Americans for a moment allowed themselves to rest, play, and wander together. In the 1920s, clothing ceased to be simply functional fabric and became a visible expression of leisure itself. After years of wartime restraint, when materials were rationed and practicality was prized above adornment, the post-war decade unfurled into one of experimentation, boldness, and public display. To walk through an American city in these years was to see leisure performed through clothing, men and women not merely dressing for comfort or necessity, but dressing to be seen, admired, and identified as part of a culture newly enamored with appearance. Window shopping emerged as one of the simplest yet most popular forms of this fashion-centered leisure. Department stores, which had been steadily growing since the late 19th century, now dominated urban centers with their glass displays, elaborate mannequins, and themed arrangements. Stores like Macy's in New York, Marshall Field's in Chicago, and Wanamaker's in Philadelphia offered entire floors dedicated not just to clothing, but to the art of presenting clothing as a spectacle. The streets outside these stores became pedestrian theaters, where passers-by slowed their pace to study the arrangements, to dream of new garments, or simply to enjoy the visual feast without any purchase at all. For many, the act of looking, of admiring silk dresses, felt cloche hats, or tailored suits, was its own form of leisure, accessible even to those with limited means. Inside the department stores, shopping was elevated into a ritual, no longer confined to small specialty shops where transactions were personal and swift. The department store offered an environment where one could wander freely, touching fabrics, comparing styles, and imagining oneself transformed by new attire. Women in particular found these spaces liberating, for shopping was one of the few leisure activities in which they could participate independently, navigating stores on their own terms. Cafes and tea rooms built into department stores extended the experience, allowing afternoons to be spent in an atmosphere that blended commerce with social life. Fashion itself reflected the shifting patterns of leisure in the decade. Women's clothing grew freer, lighter, and shorter, shedding the restrictive corsets and floor-length skirts of earlier years. The flapper style, with its straight silhouettes, knee-length hemlines and bobbed hair, became iconic, a symbol of modern womanhood and urban leisure. The very cut of the dress encouraged movement. Dancing, walking, and mingling were made easier by designs that valued freedom over formality. Accessories, from long strings of pearls to feathered headbands, added to the image of playful self-presentation. To dress in the style of the decade was not only to keep up with trends but to announce one's participation in a culture where leisure and fashion were intertwined. Men's fashion also adapted to new rhythms of leisure. While business suits remained a staple, leisure wear expanded to include lighter fabrics, +4s for golfing, and straw-boater hats for summer outings. The rise of sports and automobile culture influenced clothing choices, as sweaters, blazers, and driving coats became associated with recreation. Even the tuxedo, once strictly formal, became a more common element of evening leisure, worn in dance halls, nightclubs, and theaters. Clothing in this way reflected not just work or duty, but the activities people pursued in their hours of freedom. The streets themselves became stages for fashion. To stroll through downtown areas in cities like New York, Chicago, or San Francisco was to participate in a ritual of visibility. Sidewalks filled with men and women dressed in their best, using public space as a backdrop for display. It was not necessary to spend money to enjoy fashion as leisure. One could simply walk, observe, and absorb the changing silhouettes and colors that defined the decade. This ritual of strolling was not unlike the promenade traditions of Europe, but in the United States it took on a distinctly modern urban flavor, tied to department stores, electric signage, and the hum of automobiles passing by. Leisure and fashion intersected in more personal spaces as well. Young people experimenting with new styles often treated the act of dressing as a form of play, a chance to try on identities and to align themselves with the broader culture of modernity. Mirrors, wardrobes, and photographs became part of this process, as individuals not only wore fashion but reflected upon how they appeared in it. In this way, fashion blurred the line between public and private leisure, existing both in the shared spaces of city streets and in the quiet rituals of bedrooms and parlors. The democratization of fashion, made possible by mass production, also reshaped leisure. Ready-to-wear clothing, sold in department stores and catalogs, allowed people of modest means to access trends once reserved for the wealthy. Sears and Montgomery Ward catalogs delivered fashion to rural households, enabling women in small towns to mimic the styles of big city flappers or men to adopt the tailored look of urban professionals. Leisure and fashion was not restricted to those who could afford Paris couture. It was a pastime that stretched across class and geography, binding Americans together through shared styles and aspirations. Even cinema reinforced fashion as leisure. Silent film stars like Clara Bow, Louise Brooks, and Rudolph Valentino became icons whose clothing choices inspired audiences. To watch a movie was not only to follow a story, but to absorb the latest trends, to notice a hairstyle or dress that might later be sought in a department store. The feedback loop between film, fashion, and shopping deepened the integration of style into leisure, ensuring that appearance remained central to how people spent and imagined their free time. By the end of the 1920s, fashion had become a visible marker of the decade's leisure culture. To shop, to window browse, to stroll, or simply to admire the latest styles was to participate in a shared language of modernity. Clothing was no longer just a necessity of daily life, but a medium through which leisure expressed itself, colorful, public, and performative. The act of being seen in the right attire was itself a pastime, as much a part of free time as dancing, watching films, or driving into the countryside. In this way, fashion revealed the underlying theme of 1920s leisure, that it was not only about activities but about appearances, not only about what one did in free hours, but how one looked while doing it. The streets, stores, and theaters of the decade were filled with garments that shimmered with both fabric and meaning, stitching together the ordinary rituals of shopping and strolling into a broader pattern of cultural change. Fashion, in short, was leisure lived on the body, performed in public, and remembered in the photographs that captured an age forever linked to its distinctive style. Among the quieter pleasures of the Roaring Twenties, reading occupied a place of steady importance, shaping not only how Americans spent their spare time, but also how they imagined themselves within a rapidly changing world. While the decade dazzled with jazz rhythms, cinema palaces, and the glow of amusement parks, it also produced an extraordinary appetite for words, consumed through newspapers, magazines, novels, and pulps. Leisure for many unfolded not in the clamor of city streets, but in the turning of pages, the flicker of headlines, or the stories whispered from a paperback by lamplight at home. The decade's appetite for print was nourished by an expanding publishing industry and the spread of literacy. By the 1920s, literacy rates in the United States had risen to unprecedented levels, the result of public education reforms of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. With more Americans able to read fluently, and with more leisure time available thanks to shorter work weeks in some industries, print culture flourished. Newspapers reached into nearly every household, while magazines and inexpensive books expanded their presence in both cities and small towns. Reading, once a privilege of the few, became a commonplace form of daily leisure. Newspapers remained the most widely consumed printed material, serving as both information and entertainment. Big city dailies like the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, and the Los Angeles Times reached hundreds of thousands of readers each day, while local papers provided communities with a sense of connection to national and international events. Headlines blared news of prohibition raids, sports victories, political debates, and Hollywood gossip, turning the morning or evening paper into a ritual that blended workaday habit with a form of escape. Comics, advice columns, and serialized stories gave lighter dimensions to newspaper reading, ensuring that even those uninterested in politics or finance could find something to occupy a quiet half hour. Magazines, however, defined the literary leisure of the 1920s with a vibrancy that mirrored the cultural dynamism of the decade itself. General interest magazines like the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's provided fiction, commentary, and illustrations that reached millions. They carried short stories by writers who would later become canonical, such as F. Scott Fitzgerald, whose tales of young love and urban excess often appeared in the glossy pages before becoming novels. Illustrations by artists like Norman Rockwell lent visual life to these magazines, making them objects of both reading and viewing pleasure. For many, to leaf through a weekly or monthly magazine was to encounter the decade's ideas and images condensed into a portable leisure object. Specialized magazines also flourished, reflecting the fragmentation of interests in modern America. Ladies' Home Journal and Good Housekeeping catered to domestic life, offering advice on fashion, cooking, and interior decoration. Time, founded in 1923, introduced a new model of concise news reporting that fit into the pace of modern living. Popular Science and Popular Mechanics satisfied a growing fascination with technology and invention. Even hobbyists found material in magazines devoted to photography, gardening, or sports. Reading was not simply a passive act. It was a way to participate in the widening landscape of consumer culture and specialized leisure pursuits. Beyond newspapers and magazines, pulp fiction became a particularly striking phenomenon of the 1920s. Printed on cheap wood pulp paper and sold at low prices, pulp magazines carried lurid adventure stories, detective tales, and early forms of science fiction to an eager audience. Titles like Weird Tales, founded in 1923, and Black Mask offered readers fast-paced narratives filled with mystery, horror, or crime, often accompanied by dramatic cover art. These stories were rarely considered high literature, but they provided countless hours of leisure to working-class readers who sought excitement and escape in their free time. The pulps helped create enduring genres and launched the careers of writers like Dashiell Hammett, who would go on to shape the detective novel. Libraries played a crucial role in shaping reading as leisure during this period. Funded in part by the Carnegie Library movement of earlier decades, public libraries were well established by the 1920s, offering free access to books, periodicals, and quiet reading rooms. For those unable to afford their own subscriptions or collections, the library provided a democratic space where leisure could be spent in quiet absorption. Students, workers, and families alike could use these institutions to access not only novels and histories, but also the growing output of children's literature, which became an important part of family life during the decade. Reading also intersected with the broader cultural explosion of the Harlem Renaissance, which gave voice to African American writers and poets who reshaped American literature. Works by Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Claude McKay circulated both within black communities and beyond, carried by magazines like The Crisis and Opportunity. To read their poetry and prose was to engage with the complexities of race, identity, and modern life, turning leisure into an act of cultural encounter. For many Americans, the literary boom of the 1920s was not only about entertainment, but also about expanding awareness of voices previously unheard in mainstream literature. Book reading, too, retained a central role. Novels by Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Sinclair Lewis, and Edith Wharton shaped the cultural imagination, while the publication of works like Lewis's Main Street, 1920, and Babbitt, 1922, captured the discontents of middle-class life. These novels were discussed in reading groups, in universities, and in quiet conversations between friends, forming a quieter, more reflective leisure that balanced the louder entertainments of the decade. For those who had the time and inclination, to spend an evening with a novel remained one of the most rewarding forms of personal leisure. In homes, reading often unfolded as a communal activity. Families might gather around the evening paper, with one member reading aloud sections of news or serialized fiction. Children might listen to bedtime stories from illustrated books, while adults retreated with magazines or novels. The presence of reading materials in the home signaled a cultural shift. Leisure was not only about public spaces like dance halls or amusement parks, but also about private domestic spaces filled with words and imagination. By the close of the 1920s, the literary boom had become one of the most enduring features of the decade's leisure. While jazz bands faded, prohibition ended, and silent films gave way to talkies, the culture of reading remained a steady thread, woven into daily life across class, race, and region. Newspapers, magazines, pulp stories, and novels each offered different textures of leisure, shaping how Americans imagined their world and their place within it. In the stillness of evenings, when radios went silent and streets grew dark, the rustle of turning pages reminded Americans that leisure could be found not only in sound and spectacle, but also in words, patiently read and quietly absorbed. The literary boom of the 1920s was not only a cultural milestone, but a testament to how leisure could be carried in the simplest of acts: the holding of a book, the scanning of a headline, or the lingering on a story that stretched beyond the moment into the timeless realm of imagination. Not every leisure hour of the Roaring Twenties unfolded in the dazzling glow of electric signs or the crowded hum of amusement parks. For many Americans, perhaps for most, free time was still rooted in the home, in the familiar rooms where evenings settled slowly and the company of family or neighbors provided the backdrop to quieter forms of amusement. While the decade introduced new technologies and expanded the possibilities of leisure, home entertainment remained one of the most consistent, accessible, and enduring rhythms of everyday life. Card games, for instance, offered a nearly universal pastime. A deck of cards, inexpensive and portable, could transform an ordinary evening into a gathering marked by laughter, conversation, and competition. Families played games like bridge, poker, and rummy, each with its own rules and rituals. Bridge, in particular, rose to prominence in the 1920s, attracting not only casual players but also enthusiasts who studied strategies and formed clubs. Unlike public entertainments that required travel and expense, card games could be played around the kitchen table, with snacks nearby and children listening from the next room. Leisure in this form was intimate, shared within the small circle of the household or the close-knit web of neighbors invited to join. Board games and parlor games supplemented card play. Simple contests like checkers, dominoes, or charades offered amusement that relied as much on interaction as on competition. In rural areas, where access to theaters or dance halls was limited, such games provided one of the few regular diversions. In cities too, they remained popular, offering respite from the pace of urban life. These games required little more than time and companionship, underscoring the fact that leisure in the 1920s was as much about presence as it was about spectacle. The phonograph added a different dimension to home entertainment, one that bridged the quiet intimacy of the parlor with the broader culture of the jazz age. By the 1920s, phonographs were increasingly affordable, and records could be purchased at local shops or department stores. Families collected discs of popular jazz, dance tunes, or sentimental ballads, and evenings might unfold with a stack of records spinning on the turntable. The machine itself, with its horn or speaker, became a centerpiece of many living rooms, drawing listeners into a soundscape that extended beyond the walls of the home. Where once music required a piano or a skilled player, the phonograph democratized access, allowing households to enjoy the sounds of Louis Armstrong, Bessie Smith, or Paul Whiteman without leaving their chairs. Neighbors often gathered to share in this experience. Inviting friends to listen to records or to dance in the living room became a modest form of social entertainment, echoing the larger dance halls, but on a smaller, more personal scale. The portability of records meant that tastes could be shared and swapped. One family might lend another their latest jazz record, while another passed along sentimental waltzes or folk tunes. Leisure in this form built networks of exchange, binding communities through the sharing of sound. Home entertainment also included evenings centered around conversation and storytelling. Families without radios or phonographs relied on oral traditions, with elders recounting tales from their youth, or with neighbors trading stories of work, weather, and local gossip. The act of visiting, of calling on another household for coffee, cake, or cards, was a central feature of leisure in many communities, particularly in small towns and rural areas. Social life revolved around these domestic gatherings, where hospitality and companionship were themselves forms of entertainment. The radio, which had begun to spread widely in the mid-1920s, also reshaped home entertainment, blending public culture with private space. While earlier in the decade, families relied more on phonographs and face-to-face company, by the later years they increasingly gathered around radios to listen to music, news, or comedy shows. Yet even as radio grew, it often supplemented rather than replaced older forms of home entertainment, weaving sound into evenings that still included games, conversation, or music played from records. Seasonal rhythms shaped domestic leisure as well. In winter, with nights long and travel difficult, households turned inward, devoting hours to reading, sewing, knitting, or playing music on pianos and fiddles. In summer, porches became extensions of living rooms, where neighbors sat together, fanning themselves against the heat, while children played nearby. The rhythms of leisure in the home followed not only cultural trends, but also the cycles of weather, work, and family life, grounding the decade's new entertainments in older patterns of domesticity. The home also functioned as a stage for rituals of hospitality that gave leisure its social meaning. Serving tea or coffee, setting out plates of cookies or slices of pie, arranging chairs in a circle, these acts prepared the household for entertainment, signaling that leisure was not only about diversion, but about connection. In this sense, home entertainment in the 1920s preserved traditions of community that stretched back into earlier decades, even as it incorporated new technologies and cultural forms. By the close of the decade, the balance between public and private leisure had shifted, but the home remained central. Even those who went to movies, amusement parks, or sporting events returned to households, where evenings might still end with a game of cards, a record on the phonograph, or a conversation that lingered into the night. The glamour of the Roaring Twenties existed alongside the quiet hum of domestic leisure, each shaping the other in a rhythm that defined American life. The rise of the automobile also reshaped women's leisure, enabling greater mobility and independence. Women could drive to visit friends, attend club meetings, or go on outings with family. This mobility granted a measure of autonomy that earlier generations had lacked, reinforcing the sense that leisure could be chosen and pursued rather than simply inherited from tradition. For rural women, the car offered access to town events, movies, or shopping trips that might otherwise have been unreachable. Leisure, in this sense, was tied to the expanding geography of women's lives. Sports and physical activity also began to enter women's leisure in new ways. While participation was often constrained by prevailing gender norms, women increasingly joined tennis clubs, went swimming at beaches or pools, or attended exercise classes. The 1920s saw the emergence of women's collegiate athletics and recreational leagues, though often framed as healthful rather than competitive pursuits. Leisure through physical activity reflected both the changing image of women's bodies, emphasizing slimness, vitality, and youth, and the broader cultural emphasis on recreation as a sign of modern life. At the same time, women of color often faced different opportunities and restrictions in leisure. African American women, for instance, participated actively in the Harlem Renaissance through clubs, salons, and artistic endeavors, creating leisure spaces that doubled as sites of cultural resistance and community affirmation. Latina, Asian, and Native American women navigated their own cultural traditions alongside the shifting expectations of the broader society. Leisure was not experienced equally. It was shaped by access, income, and social barriers that defined who could participate in certain clubs, theaters, or resorts. Even within the home, leisure for women shifted in subtle but important ways. The growth of household technologies, such as washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and electric irons, was often promoted as labor-saving, but they also redefined the rhythms of domestic life, potentially creating small increments of time that women could devote to reading, visiting, or rest. Advertisements from the period promised that these appliances would grant women more leisure, even if the reality was often more complex. Still, the rhetoric surrounding home technologies underscored the cultural association between modernity and the promise of free time. By the decade's close, leisure for women in the 1920s stood as both a reflection of progress and a reminder of constraints. Women enjoyed greater opportunities for self-expression, community involvement, and public presence than in earlier generations. Yet, leisure remained shaped by class, race, and social expectation, balancing the allure of the flapper with the persistence of domestic routines. In beauty parlors and women's clubs, in department stores and living rooms, women carved out spaces of enjoyment and rest, weaving leisure into the fabric of everyday life, in ways both subtle and profound. In the quiet of a parlor, with women gathered around magazines or cards, or in the hum of a beauty shop with hairdryers and chatter, one sees how leisure for women in the 1920s mirrored the broader transformation of American society. It was at once personal and public, traditional and modern, constrained and liberating, an intricate reflection of a decade defined by change. The Roaring Twenties were not simply a decade of collective leisure, they were also an era in which youth, in particular, began to define themselves through pastimes that marked a sharp break with the values of their parents and grandparents. Teenagers and young adults of the 1920s grew up in a world that felt distinctly different from that of the preceding decades, a world of automobiles, jazz, radio broadcasts, and mass culture, where modernity seemed to hum in the background of daily life. Their leisure was not only a way of passing time, it was a statement of identity, a declaration of generational difference, and in many cases a rebellion against the older traditions of restraint, formality, and modesty. At the center of this youth rebellion was jazz music. To older ears, jazz sounded chaotic, sensual, and undisciplined, with syncopated rhythms and improvisations that defied classical conventions. For young people, however, it embodied freedom. The music was played in dance halls, on phonographs, and over radio waves, providing an accessible soundtrack to evenings that stretched later than their parents considered respectable. The Charleston, the Black Bottom, and the Shimmy were dances associated with jazz rhythms, and they symbolized an expressive bodily freedom that shocked conservative observers. Dance floors became arenas where generational conflict played out. Elders saw impropriety, while youth felt liberation. The automobile accelerated this shift by providing a literal vehicle for rebellion. With Ford's Model T affordable to middle-class families, young people gained unprecedented mobility. Cars offered opportunities to escape the watchful eyes of parents, to go for late-night drives, to attend dances in other towns, or to visit roadside speakeasies. The automobile became closely linked with dating culture, as couples used cars for private conversation, intimacy, or simply the thrill of cruising. For older generations, the car represented both convenience and danger. For the young, it was a symbol of independence. Leisure was no longer confined to porches or parlors. It could now be pursued on the open road. Dances and parties reinforced this generational divide. In high schools, colleges, and urban dance halls, young people gathered in ways that emphasized collective identity. The image of the flapper was central here. Young women cut their hair short, wore skirts above the knee, smoked cigarettes and drank alcohol in defiance of traditional gender expectations. Young men, too, cultivated leisure identities through dress, slang, and participation in nightlife. Jazz clubs, even when hidden behind the facades of speakeasies, attracted younger patrons eager to test the boundaries of prohibition laws and social mores. The leisure of youth became inseparable from experimentation, whether in music, dress, or behavior. Education itself provided a context for this rebellion. High school enrollment rose sharply during the 1920s, as more teenagers spent extended years together in classrooms and extracurricular activities. This concentration of young people created a peer culture distinct from that of adults, and leisure flourished within it. Football games, dances, and school clubs reinforced a sense of generational identity. College campuses amplified this dynamic, with fraternities, sororities, and athletic events shaping the leisure of young adults. Universities were often sites where older traditions met youthful exuberance, producing conflicts over dress codes, curfews, or acceptable behavior. The leisure rebellion of youth also extended into consumption. Young people embraced fashion trends that scandalized their elders, purchasing cosmetics, short dresses, or stylish suits. They spent allowances or wages from part-time jobs on movies, phonograph records, and cosmetics, industries that recognized youth as a distinct market. The very concept of teen culture began to take shape during this period, as advertisers targeted their tastes and capitalized on their desire to differentiate from older generations. Leisure in this sense was commercialized rebellion, sold in the form of records, clothes, and dances. Older generations responded with concern, framing youth leisure as evidence of moral decline. Newspapers published editorials lamenting the wild parties of flappers and collegiates. Religious leaders preached against the dangers of jazz and the corrupting influence of dance halls. Parents worried about the loss of control over their children's activities, particularly with the automobile enabling unsupervised freedom. The generation gap widened, not necessarily because youth were behaving more recklessly than in past eras, but because modern technology and mass culture amplified the visibility of their rebellion. Not all young people participated equally in this culture of rebellion. Class and geography played significant roles. Rural youth often faced more limited opportunities for leisure, though they too adopted jazz, dances, and automobiles where possible. Working-class youth in cities might not afford all the latest fashions but still participated in the broader cultural currents through affordable movies or inexpensive phonograph records. African American youth contributed centrally to the culture of rebellion through jazz, dance, and literature, particularly in urban centers like Harlem, where their creative expression influenced the entire nation. Yet their leisure often unfolded under the shadow of segregation, shaped by both innovation and exclusion. The rebellion of youth leisure in the 1920s did not dismantle older traditions entirely. Instead, it created a layered society where generational differences were starkly visible. While parents hosted quiet card games at home, their children might be sneaking out to dance to jazz until dawn. While older women met in clubs to discuss civic reform, younger women cut their hair short and painted their lips red in beauty parlors. The same decade contained both restraint and rebellion, but the cultural imagination increasingly focused on the spectacle of youthful leisure as a symbol of the age. By the end of the decade, youth had carved out a cultural presence that could no longer be ignored. Their dances, music, slang, and fashions were no longer merely personal choices. They defined the spirit of the Roaring Twenties itself. Leisure, in their hands, became rebellion, a way of asserting that the modern world was theirs to shape. In this way, the free time of young Americans in the 1920s did more than pass idle hours. It redrew the boundaries of generational identity, setting the stage for the cultural transformations that would follow in the decades ahead. The story of leisure in 1920s America would be incomplete without pausing to consider how African Americans, particularly in urban centers, reshaped cultural life through their own distinctive practices of free time. The decade coincided with what became known as the Harlem Renaissance, a flowering of African American artistic, intellectual and social expression centered in New York City, but reverberating throughout the country. Leisure for African Americans was not simply about relaxation, it was about creating spaces of dignity, cultural pride and community, at a time when segregation and racial inequality continued to limit access to many mainstream venues. In this sense, leisure was both an act of enjoyment and a form of resistance, a way of carving out cultural independence within an often hostile social landscape. Harlem itself became a symbolic epicenter of this transformation. Migrants from the South had poured into northern cities during the Great Migration, and Harlem grew into a vibrant neighborhood where African American cultural life flourished. Leisure activities there took on many forms, from formal poetry readings to informal gatherings in rented halls or private homes. The neighborhood became a magnet for artists, musicians, writers, and intellectuals who sought both expression and community. Within its cafes, clubs, and churches, African Americans forged a leisure culture that would redefine the decade's image of modernity. Jazz, which had emerged in New Orleans and spread through the Midwest, found a particularly fertile home in Harlem. Venues such as the Cotton Club, the Savoy Ballroom, and countless smaller establishments became centers of music, dance, and social gathering, though some of the most famous clubs were segregated in terms of audience, with white patrons attending to consume African American culture, while black residents were often excluded. African Americans nonetheless cultivated their own musical spaces where creativity thrived. The improvisational energy of jazz turned leisure into performance, a participatory act where musicians and dancers alike shaped the atmosphere. Nights in Harlem resounded with the rhythms of Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Fletcher Henderson, musicians whose artistry transformed leisure into an art form recognized across the nation. Alongside music, poetry and literature flourished as part of the Harlem Renaissance. Writers such as Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, and Zora Neale Hurston contributed to a literary scene that was closely intertwined with leisure gatherings. Poetry readings, salons, and literary clubs provided venues where ideas circulated freely, blending artistry with sociability. For African Americans, these spaces represented both leisure and empowerment, places where expression was not only permitted but celebrated. The act of gathering to hear a poem or discuss a story became a form of cultural affirmation, reinforcing a collective identity in the face of widespread marginalization. Dance also played a central role in African American leisure. The Savoy Ballroom, open to black patrons and famous for its integrated crowds, hosted dancers who innovated styles such as the Lindy Hop. These communal spaces encouraged physical expression, sociability, and collective enjoyment. Dancing was not only a way of passing the evening, but also a symbolic act of vitality, showcasing resilience and joy. Even amid the harsh realities of discrimination, African American leisure emphasized creativity, rhythm, and energy, cultivating moments of beauty that stood in contrast to societal exclusion. Religious and community gatherings also shaped leisure time. African American churches, long central to community life, hosted musical performances, lectures, and social events that blended spiritual uplift with cultural expression. Fraternal organizations, women's clubs, and mutual aid societies provided additional spaces for collective leisure, often tied to civic engagement. These groups demonstrated how African Americans turned free time into opportunities for both recreation and solidarity, reinforcing community bonds that extended beyond entertainment. The Harlem Renaissance and its associated leisure culture resonated beyond Harlem itself. African American musicians toured across the country, bringing jazz to cities from Chicago to Kansas City to Los Angeles. The phonograph and radio spread the sounds of black artistry to households far from its origins, even as many of those households remained socially segregated. African American leisure practices thus entered the mainstream, influencing broader American culture while retaining their grounding in black community life. The dual nature of this process, cultural appropriation by white audiences, alongside genuine admiration, underscored the complex role of race in shaping leisure during the 1920s. At the same time, segregation and exclusion defined the boundaries of African American leisure. Black families were often denied access to public parks, beaches, or theaters that catered to white patrons. In response, African Americans created their own spaces. Resorts such as Idlewild in Michigan or American Beach in Florida provided leisure havens where black vacationers could enjoy recreation free from discrimination. These spaces illustrated the resourcefulness with which African Americans carved out opportunities for leisure within a society that systematically restricted them. By the end of the decade, the cultural vitality of African American leisure had left a permanent imprint on American life. The music, literature, and dance that grew out of black communities not only enriched leisure for African Americans themselves, but also redefined leisure for the nation as a whole. Jazz became the soundtrack of the decade, while poetry and fiction from Harlem helped shape modernist literature more broadly. The creativity expressed in African American leisure thus transcended the immediate circumstances of exclusion, leaving a legacy that extended into subsequent decades. In the quiet rhythm of a Harlem poetry reading, in the swinging energy of a Savoy ballroom dance, or in the laughter of friends gathered in a church basement, one sees how African American leisure in the 1920s combined artistry, resilience, and joy. It was both deeply communal and profoundly transformative, a reflection of how free time could become a foundation for cultural renaissance. Leisure, in this context, was not only about escape from labor, but about the creation of beauty, identity, and pride. If the cities of the 1920s dazzled with neon signs, movie palaces, and speakeasies, the countryside offered an altogether different kind of leisure, one grounded in seasonality, community gatherings, and the slower pace of farm life. For the millions of Americans who still lived in rural areas, free time was scarce and often framed by agricultural demands, yet when it appeared, it carried with it traditions of shared enjoyment that tied people together. Leisure on the farm was not about anonymity, as it often was in cities, but about reinforcing bonds with neighbors, family, and community institutions that had long sustained rural life. At the center of rural leisure were county fairs. These annual gatherings served as both entertainment and agricultural showcase, blending competition with festivity. Farmers brought livestock, produce, and crafted goods to be judged, while visitors wandered among stalls, sampling foods, watching demonstrations, or riding newly installed Ferris wheels and carousels. For many rural families, the fair was the year's highlight, a brief pause from the demands of plowing, planting, and harvesting. It was a time when neighbors who lived miles apart could reconnect, when children might see prize-winning animals, and when farm women displayed their canning, baking, or quilting. The fair blended recreation with pride, reminding participants of the skills and productivity that defined their community. Church gatherings were equally central. On Sundays, rural Americans did not simply attend religious services. They often lingered afterward for socializing, meals, and community events. Church picnics provided opportunities for relaxation beneath trees, with long tables laden with fried chicken, pies, and home-cooked dishes. These gatherings fostered a sense of belonging, where leisure intertwined with spiritual life and reinforced moral expectations. Singing, storytelling, and games for children filled the hours, and though modest compared to city amusements, such gatherings provided joy and connection. The rhythm of the church calendar itself, with revivals, holidays, and festivals, gave rural leisure a cyclical structure tied to faith as much as to agriculture. Evenings on the porch formed another staple of farm leisure. With long summer days spent in the fields, families often gathered after sunset to rest in rocking chairs, listen to the quiet sounds of insects, or share stories with neighbors who stopped by. Without the hum of radio in many homes until the latter part of the decade, conversation, music played on a fiddle or harmonica, and the simple presence of others defined these moments. Leisure here was not about spectacle but about slowing the pace of life, about savoring the coolness after heat, or the companionship after labor. It reflected a continuity of traditions stretching back into the 19th century, where evenings were measured not by entertainment schedules but by the fading of light. Seasonal events also shaped rural leisure. Harvest festivals brought communities together in autumn, marking the completion of hard labor with celebration. Barn dances provided lively evenings of music and movement, with fiddlers playing reels and squares that contrasted with the syncopated rhythms of urban jazz. Quilting bees, corn husking gatherings and ice cream socials brought neighbors together for work-turned-play, where tasks became occasions for laughter and storytelling. These events illustrated how rural leisure often blurred the boundaries between labor and recreation, embedding enjoyment within the fabric of daily survival. Rural leisure was also shaped by limited resources. Many farms lacked electricity until the late 1920s and 1930s, which meant fewer radios or electric appliances. Travel to distant cities was infrequent, and movies, while increasingly popular, were often seen only on occasional trips to town. Yet these limitations also reinforced the creativity of local leisure. Homemade games, folk music, and simple outdoor play filled the hours. Children might swim in creeks during summer or skate on frozen ponds in winter. Leisure reflected the land itself, seasonal rhythms dictating not only labor but recreation. Community organizations such as the Grange or 4-H clubs provided another dimension. These groups offered opportunities for farm families to gather, learn and socialize. Agricultural fairs sponsored by such organizations included lectures, competitions and exhibitions that blended education with entertainment. For rural youth, particularly those in 4-H, leisure activities often revolved around raising animals, gardening, or craft projects that instilled both responsibility and pride. These forms of leisure differed from the consumer-oriented culture of cities, reflecting instead a blending of work ethic with enjoyment. Racial and regional differences also shaped rural leisure. In the South, African American communities organized church gatherings, picnics and music events within the constraints of segregation, sustaining cultural traditions through spirituals, blues and communal meals. In immigrant farming communities across the Midwest, leisure often reflected Old World traditions brought from Europe, Polish, German, or Scandinavian festivals that carried dances, foods and songs across the Atlantic and into American soil. Leisure on the farm, though modest, was never uniform. It reflected the diversity of rural America itself. For many farmers, however, the decade's economic challenges cast a shadow over leisure. Falling crop prices after World War I left families with limited disposable income, and leisure often meant inexpensive or homemade activities. Trips to the county fair or to town movies required money for tickets and travel, luxuries not always available. Thus, while the Roaring Twenties sparkled with images of abundance, rural leisure was often constrained by economic reality. Free time carried with it a frugality that underscored its contrast with urban extravagance. Still, rural leisure in the 1920s should not be seen as a lesser counterpart to urban amusement. Instead, it embodied a rhythm of life that valued connection, tradition, and the landscape itself. A county fair midway, a church picnic table, or a porch filled with neighbors in rocking chairs represented continuity and resilience. These forms of leisure preserved community bonds, provided relief from demanding labor, and offered moments of joy that did not require neon lights or jazz bands. In their quiet, they reflected a different America, one that moved at a slower pace, but whose cultural weight was no less important in defining the decade. By the close of the 1920s, as urbanization and mass culture spread, rural leisure would increasingly absorb elements of the modern age. Radios reaching farmhouses, automobiles bringing greater mobility, and movies appearing in small-town theaters. Yet the essence of rural leisure, grounded in fairs, porches and community gatherings, endured. It was a leisure rooted not in the fleeting glamour of cities, but in the enduring rhythms of land, family and tradition. The 1920s were not merely defined by music, dance and cultural shifts, but also by the quiet, almost unnoticed ways that new technologies altered the very structure of free time. Leisure, which had once been dictated by the natural rhythms of daylight, weather, and seasonal labor, was increasingly restructured by the steady spread of electricity, telephones, and household innovations. In this sense, technology intruded upon leisure, not as a disruption, but as a reshaping force, extending the day, accelerating communication, and altering domestic life in ways that would ripple far into the 20th century. Electric lighting was perhaps the most transformative of these changes. Before widespread electrification, evenings in many American homes had been dim affairs, reliant on kerosene lamps, candles, or gas lights. By the 1920s, however, electricity had spread rapidly through cities and was gradually reaching smaller towns and more prosperous rural communities. With the simple flick of a switch, nights could be extended far beyond sundown. Families could gather under bright lights to play cards, read newspapers, or listen to phonographs. Children could do homework after dark, and adults could work on crafts or correspondence with greater ease. Leisure itself was lengthened, stretched beyond the limitations of the natural day, allowing evenings to become social and recreational in new ways. The glow of electric lights spilled out onto city streets as well, transforming night into a time for movement, shopping, and entertainment, blurring the old division between work hours and leisure hours. The telephone was another subtle yet profound influence. First introduced in the late 19th century, by the 1920s it had become increasingly common in urban and suburban homes, though less so in rural areas where party lines still dominated. The telephone changed leisure by collapsing distance, allowing people to plan outings, share news, or simply engage in conversation without leaving home. In a time when social visits had required lengthy walks or carriage rides, the telephone made connection immediate. It fostered a new kind of leisure that was less formal, more spontaneous, and woven into daily life. Young people in particular embraced the telephone as a tool for arranging dances, dates, or group outings, while families used it to maintain ties with relatives scattered by migration to cities. Household appliances, meanwhile, altered leisure in a more indirect but equally significant way. Electric washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and refrigerators, though still expensive and not yet universal, began reducing the heavy labor that had once defined domestic life, particularly for women. Tasks that had consumed entire days could now be accomplished more quickly, leaving more hours available for reading, visiting, or attending social events. Advertisements of the period explicitly promised that these devices would give back time to the homemaker, framing leisure as a commodity purchased alongside the machine. Though much of this rhetoric overstated the degree of freedom granted, domestic labor remained substantial. The psychological shift was important. Leisure was increasingly seen as something that could be manufactured by efficiency, not just stolen from work. The radio, though primarily an entertainment device, also exemplified how technology merged with leisure. Sitting at home, families could listen to live music, sports broadcasts, or presidential addresses, experiences that once required attendance at a venue or reliance on newspapers. The radio made leisure communal, but also national, linking millions of Americans through shared broadcasts. In this way, technology reshaped not only the content of leisure, but also its social dimensions, fostering a collective soundscape where individuals felt part of a larger cultural experience while remaining in their living rooms. Electric streetcars and the growing use of electric infrastructure in public spaces also altered leisure outside the home. Brightly lit theaters, department stores open in the evening, and amusement parks glowing with bulbs invited people to treat nighttime as an extension of day. Couples could stroll through illuminated boulevards or boardwalks, while families could shop or attend movies after work hours. Leisure thus expanded into new times and spaces, enabled by the reliability and safety of electric light. Yet for all its benefits, technological intrusion also carried subtle shifts that were not universally celebrated. Some older Americans lamented that the telephone disrupted traditional visiting practices, replacing face-to-face connection with a disembodied voice. Electric lights blurred the natural rhythms of day and night, fostering a sense that rest could be postponed indefinitely. Appliances, while marketed as liberators, also raised expectations for cleanliness and domestic productivity. sometimes increasing rather than reducing pressure on women. Technology, in this way, intruded not only by offering more leisure, but by subtly redefining what counted as proper use of time. The spread of these technologies also revealed sharp divides. Wealthier urban households enjoyed the benefits of electrification and appliances much earlier than poor or rural families, many of whom remained without electricity until the 1930s or even later. Leisure therefore became stratified, with technology creating new inequalities in how free time was experienced. For those with access, leisure could mean illuminated evenings, instant communication, and labor-saving conveniences. For others, the rhythms of kerosene lamps, hand-washing, and manual labor remained the norm, underscoring the uneven pace of modernization. By the end of the decade, the technological shaping of leisure had become a quiet fact of daily life. Telephones rang, lights glowed late into the night, and appliances whirred in kitchens, each device subtly altering the boundaries of work and rest. Leisure was no longer defined only by tradition or community, but by access to these machines, by the hum of electricity and the immediacy of communication. The intrusion of technology, far from diminishing leisure, had created a new landscape where free time was stretched, restructured, and increasingly modern. What had once been a rocking chair on a porch became, for many, a family circle around a radio. What had once been hours spent scrubbing clothes by hand became a freed afternoon for reading or socializing. Leisure in the 1920s was not only about how Americans chose to spend their time, but about how technology gave them new hours, new rhythms, and new ways of connecting. It was an intrusion that in retrospect feels less like disruption and more like the steady ticking of modern life settling into place. The 1920s, remembered in popular imagination as the Roaring Twenties, often evoke images of flappers dancing in smoky jazz clubs, baseball crowds cheering at stadiums, and sleek automobiles gliding along city streets. Yet behind this glittering facade lay a more complicated reality, one in which access to leisure was profoundly uneven. The decade's fun was never shared equally, but filtered through class, race, gender, and geography, creating stark contrasts in how Americans experienced their free time. The picture of endless parties and modern amusements belonged largely to a specific slice of the population, while others continued to live lives where leisure remained limited, constrained, or altogether elusive. Class differences stood at the heart of this unevenness. The wealthy, especially those residing in major cities or vacationing in coastal resorts, enjoyed leisure as a kind of spectacle. Their evenings might be spent at exclusive clubs, country estates, or European-style theaters, where luxury defined entertainment. They could travel to Florida for winter holidays, sail on cruises, or spend summers at mountain resorts. Their leisure often blurred with status, signaling both cultural refinement and financial privilege. By contrast, the middle class had begun to embrace new forms of leisure, going to the movies, attending baseball games, or purchasing radios and phonographs for the home. For this growing group, leisure was accessible but still modest, defined more by affordability and convenience than extravagance. Meanwhile, the working poor experienced leisure, primarily in brief intervals between long hours of labor. Factory schedules, domestic service and agricultural work left little time for leisure, and when it came, it was often rooted in community rituals, church gatherings, neighborhood card games, or informal social visits, rather than costly amusements. Race added another layer of disparity. African Americans, while creating vibrant leisure cultures through jazz, literature, and community gatherings, faced persistent segregation and exclusion from mainstream venues. In many cities, theaters, amusement parks, swimming pools, and restaurants barred black patrons, forcing them to establish their own spaces for leisure. Resorts such as Idlewild in Michigan became havens where African Americans could vacation without humiliation, while Harlem emerged as a cultural hub where music and literature flourished despite broader discrimination. Yet, even within this creativity, leisure remained unequal. Black performers often entertained segregated white audiences in places like the Cotton Club, while being denied entry as guests themselves. The cultural wealth of African American leisure thus coexisted with systemic barriers that made the pursuit of simple recreation a reminder of social inequality. geography further shaped disparities in leisure. Urban residents, particularly in cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, were surrounded by theaters, dance halls, amusement parks, and department stores that invited participation in the new consumer culture of leisure. The city street, illuminated by neon and alive with activity, offered a stage for strolling, shopping, or people watching. In contrast, rural residents, who still made up nearly half of the population in the early 1920s, experienced leisure at a slower rhythm. County fairs, church picnics, and evenings on front porches defined their recreation, far removed from the bustling energy of urban nightlife. While the city dweller might end an evening in a jazz club or movie palace, the farmer might spend it rocking quietly as cicadas hummed in the distance, shaped more by season and harvest than by radio schedules or dance crazes. Gender also influenced access to leisure. For men, especially those in the middle class, leisure often extended outside the home, in clubs, sporting events, or taverns, even illicit speakeasies during Prohibition. Women whose roles were evolving found leisure increasingly tied to beauty parlors, shopping excursions, or women's clubs. For younger women, the 1920s brought unprecedented opportunities. Flappers embraced jazz, dancing, and new fashions as a form of leisure tied to independence. Yet for many women, particularly those bound by domestic responsibilities or without financial resources, leisure was still confined to the home, shared with children or neighbors, rather than in public spaces. Even when appliances promised to save time, the expectation of household perfection meant that the hours freed by machines were often consumed by new standards of labor, rather than genuine leisure. Immigrant communities added another dimension. Recent arrivals from Europe often worked in industries where long shifts left little time for leisure, and what leisure they did have was frequently spent in ethnic enclaves, where familiar foods, music, and traditions provided comfort. Social halls, church festivals, and community parades became forms of leisure tied directly to cultural identity. In this way, leisure became a way of preserving heritage as much as participating in modern American trends. Children and adolescents also experienced leisure unevenly. While middle-class youth might attend movies, join scouting organizations, or participate in school sports, working-class children often contributed to household income and had limited free time. Leisure for them might mean street games or informal play rather than organized activities. Teenagers from more privileged backgrounds began to experience leisure through cars, dances, and jazz, developing a youth culture that would become more pronounced in later decades, while their working-class peers often remained constrained by economic necessity. The unevenness of leisure also intersected with consumption. Access to radios, phonographs, or automobiles was not universal, but shaped by income. A car might open up Sundays for drives and picnics for one family, while another continued to walk to church or gather with neighbors nearby. A radio might fill evenings with national broadcasts in one home, while another relied solely on word of mouth and local gatherings. Leisure was not simply about time but about access to the material goods that enabled certain experiences. In sum, the leisure of the 1920s was less a universal transformation and more a layered patchwork of experience. For some, it meant champagne in speakeasies, jazz in Harlem, or vacations at seaside resorts. For others, it remained evenings of modest games, small-town gatherings, or porch-side conversations. The Roaring Twenties roared unevenly, its glamour masking the persistence of inequality. The story of leisure in this era is as much about absence as presence, about who could not enter the movie palace, who could not afford the automobile, and who had little time to rest between shifts. The uneven spread of leisure reveals the limits of the decade's promise, but it also underscores the resilience with which different groups shaped free time according to their means. Whether in a jazz-filled Harlem club, a modest rural picnic, or a quiet kitchen lit by kerosene, Americans of all circumstances carved out leisure as best they could. What unites these disparate experiences is the recognition that leisure, however constrained, remained vital to the rhythms of daily life, even when its expression was profoundly unequal. By the final years of the decade, the rhythms of leisure in America seemed steady, almost natural, as though they had always been there and would continue unbroken into the future. Movie palaces glowed on Saturday nights, Radios crackled with orchestras and news bulletins, and automobiles carried families out of town for weekend drives. Amusement parks and dance halls still pulsed with energy, and the neon-lit city streets seemed alive with endless promise. It was a decade that had convinced many Americans that prosperity and the leisure it allowed were permanent companions. Yet beneath the surface of this golden glow lay fragile foundations, and the crash of 1929 would reveal just how tenuous much of this leisure had been. The habits of free time in the 1920s were deeply intertwined with economic confidence. Rising wages, widespread consumer credit, and the expanding availability of mass-produced goods gave people not only the means but also the expectation that leisure should be part of everyday life. Radios, phonographs, and automobiles were purchased on installment plans, making them accessible to households that would once have considered them luxuries. Entertainment industries, from cinema to professional sports, expanded with the assurance of steady audiences willing to pay admission. But these habits were built on borrowed money and fragile speculation, their sustainability linked to an economy that was far less stable than it appeared. The optimism of the decade was reflected in its leisure industries. Movie studios invested heavily in new productions and vast theaters, expecting ever-growing audiences. Automakers like Ford and General Motors expanded production, confident that Americans would continue to buy cars at record rates. Even amusement parks and dance halls planned expansions, riding on the belief that the culture of fun was unstoppable. This sense of inevitability created a quiet overconfidence, where the idea of leisure as a permanent feature of American life became woven into the nation's identity. When the stock market collapsed in October 1929, it was not only banks, investors, and factories that felt the shock. Leisure itself began to unravel, for it depended on disposable income, on optimism, and on the belief that time away from work could be spent on pleasure rather than survival. Theaters saw attendance plummet as families cut unnecessary expenses. Radios and phonographs, once bought on credit, became repossessed when payments fell behind. Automobiles sat unused, their fuel too costly for those now unemployed. Dance halls closed, amusement parks fell silent, and the bright lights of Broadway dimmed in the face of economic despair. Leisure, which had seemed a universal right in the 1920s, revealed itself as a fragile luxury in times of crisis. The contrast between the late 1920s and the early years of the Great Depression was especially striking because of how quickly habits shifted. Only months earlier, people had crowded into ballparks to watch Babe Ruth swing for home runs, lined up outside theaters for the newest talking pictures, and packed jazz clubs to dance until morning. Now, many stayed home, not from choice but from necessity, their evenings spent in silence rather than music, in worry rather than delight. The decade that had promised endless opportunity suddenly seemed distant, a dream dissolved almost overnight. Yet the leisure of the 1920s left behind a lasting cultural imprint, even as its economic foundations crumbled. Jazz continued to echo through radios, now often listened to in shared silence by families coping with unemployment. Movies remained a refuge, even when tickets could only occasionally be afforded, offering escape from the harshness of daily life. Automobiles, though less frequently driven, continued to symbolize freedom and mobility. In these ways, the habits formed during the 1920s did not vanish entirely. They were reshaped by necessity, carried forward into new contexts as Americans adapted to leaner times. The nostalgia that later generations attached to the 1920s owes much to this abrupt ending. Because the decade ended so suddenly, without a slow fading but rather a sharp rupture, the memory of its leisure became fixed in contrast with what followed. People looked back on the era as a time of joy and abundance, when evenings were filled with music and laughter, and weekends brought new adventures. This nostalgia, however, sometimes concealed the inequalities and exclusions that had shaped leisure in the first place. It was remembered as a golden age, though it had been golden only for some. The lessons of 1920s leisure were subtle but enduring. They revealed how closely leisure was tied to economic structures, how fragile the rituals of fun could be when financial security vanished, and how quickly entire industries could collapse when consumer confidence failed. Yet they also demonstrated the resilience of culture, how music, stories, and shared experiences endured even when circumstances grew bleak. Americans would carry forward the memory of the Roaring Twenties, not only as a symbol of extravagance, but also as a reminder of the limits of prosperity. In the quiet before the crash, when neon still flickered and jazz still pulsed in crowded rooms, no one could fully imagine how swiftly the mood would change. That final moment of optimism, when leisure still seemed endless, marks the poignant end of the 1920s story. What followed was hardship, but the echoes of that decade's free time, its dances, its drives, its radios, its games, remained in memory and culture, shaping leisure in America for generations to come.